Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we begin with something far from cozy firesides or nostalgic Victorian Christmas cards. This is the slow, grinding misery of life inside a 19th century workhouse. These places weren't shelters in any comforting sense. They were cold, overcrowded, and built on the idea that poverty was something to punish, not relieve. Picture waking up to the bite of winter air coming through thin, cracked windows. Imagine holding a dented tin bowl filled with watery gruel, eating in silence under the watchful eyes of supervisors. Long days spent breaking stones, scrubbing laundry, or picking apart tarred rope until your fingers bled. Nights spent lying awake in freezing dormitories, surrounded by the coughs and restless shuffling of dozens of others, all crammed into the same bleak space. The Victorian workhouse was many things, but it was never a refuge. Before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slower, sleep-friendly journeys through history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. It's always nice seeing how far these late-night stories reach. So dim the lights, settle in somewhere warm, and let your mind drift as we ease into tonight's journey, starting inside the workhouse walls. Imagine waking up on a brittle December morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like thin fog, and your blanket is little more than a scratchy piece of cloth, barely enough to cover your shoulders. The dormitory around you smells of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and old straw. Dozens of others stir nearby. Men on one side, women on the other, and children somewhere in between, all packed tightly on wooden benches or narrow beds with no real mattresses. The windows are single pane, and the frost creeps in along the corners. There's no central heating, no fireplace to gather around. Just the cold, always the cold. You pull on the only clothes you own, a rough, faded set of woolen garments, already worn thin at the elbows and knees. There's no time for lingering. A sharp bell rings out, echoing through the long stone hallways. Morning roll call, and then breakfast. But breakfast isn't something to look forward to here. It's gruel, always gruel. A watery mixture of oats and water, barely warm, served in battered tin bowls. It tastes like nothing at all, just a lukewarm sludge designed to keep you alive and not much more. You eat it quickly, spoon scraping against metal. The supervisors watch carefully to make sure no one asks for more, because there isn't more. The portion you receive has been calculated down to the ounce. 6 ounces of oatmeal, mixed with water, sometimes thinned further when supplies run low. On Sundays, if you're fortunate, there might be a sliver of bacon fat floating on the surface, a greasy reminder of what real food once tasted like. But even this meager allowance comes with conditions. You must have worked the full week. You must have shown proper deference to the master and matron. You must have attended chapel without complaint. Those who break the rules find their portions reduced further still. 3 ounces instead of 6. Water instead of the thin gruel. And always, the threat of solitary confinement in the punishment cell, where even this pitiful sustenance becomes a distant memory. Once the bowls are collected, it's time for labor. For men, this could mean breaking stones in the yard, one after another, splitting them into smaller and smaller pieces until your arms ache and your breath comes in shallow gasps. The cold doesn't stop you. It works against you. Your fingers go numb, then burn, then go numb again. But the work continues. The stones arrive in cartloads, dumped in piles throughout the yard. Each man receives his hammer, heavy and crude, a handle worn smooth by countless hands before yours. The task seems simple enough. Break the larger stones into smaller ones, then smaller still, until they're suitable for road building. But simplicity doesn't mean ease. In winter, the stones become slick with ice. Your hands, already stiff from cold, struggle to maintain their grip on the hammer handle. The metal head strikes stone, sending vibrations up your arms, into your shoulders, down your spine. Hour after hour, the rhythm becomes mechanical. Lift, strike, assess, strike again. The pile beside you grows slowly, painfully slowly, while the mountain of unbroken stones seems to mock your efforts. Your back aches from bending. Your shoulders burn from the repetitive motion. The muscles in your forearms cramp and seize. But stopping isn't an option. The overseer paces between the workers, counting strikes, measuring output, noting any sign of laziness or rebellion. Fall behind the expected quota, and you'll find yourself moved to an even less pleasant task. Some men are assigned to the treadmill, a massive wheel that must be turned by human power alone. 8 men at a time climb onto the wheel, grasping the handrail, stepping endlessly upward as the wheel turns beneath their feet. It's like climbing a staircase that never ends, never leads anywhere, serves no purpose except to exhaust the climber. The wheel powers nothing useful, generates no electricity, mills no grain. It exists purely to break the spirit through meaningless exertion. Others work the crank, another exercise in futility. A large handle must be turned thousands of times each day, spinning a gear that accomplishes nothing. The resistance can be adjusted by the overseer, making the work harder or easier, depending on his mood or his assessment of your attitude. Some days, the crank turns smoothly, allowing you to build a steady rhythm. Other days, it fights you with every rotation, as if the machine itself has been designed to hate you. For women, there's laundry. Piles of it, wet, heavy, and steaming in the frigid air as you scrub each garment by hand in large stone basins. The skin on your hands cracks and reddens, the cold water biting into already raw flesh. The laundry arrives from all corners of the workhouse. Bedsheets stained with illness and despair, clothing soiled by hard labor and poor hygiene, aprons and caps worn by the staff, expecting them returned spotless and pressed. Everything must be sorted first, categorized by color and fabric and degree of soiling. The worst items require pre-treatment, scrubbing with harsh soap that strips the skin from your knuckles. The washing tubs are carved from stone, deep and wide, filled with water that's never quite warm enough to be comfortable, but never cold enough to numb the pain. You lean over these basins for hours, your spine curved, your arms submerged to the elbows in water that turns gray and brown as the day progresses. The soap is crude, made from animal fat and lye, and it burns any open cuts or sores on your hands. Scrubbing requires pressure, force, endless repetition. Each garment must be rubbed against the washboard until every stain disappears, every trace of dirt is removed. Your knuckles scrape against the ridged metal surface, leaving them raw and bleeding. The soap works its way into these fresh wounds, creating a constant stinging reminder of your circumstances. After washing comes rinsing, requiring multiple changes of clean water. Then wringing, twisting the heavy, waterlogged fabric to remove as much moisture as possible. The wet cloth fights you, slipping from your grip, soaking your clothes, chilling you further. Finally, everything must be hung to dry, stretched across lines and rooms that are never warm enough to speed the process. In winter, laundry can take days to dry completely. Wet clothes freeze solid on the lines, becoming stiff as boards. They must be brought inside, hung near whatever minimal heat sources exist, turned and rearranged constantly to prevent mildew and decay. And through it all, more dirty laundry arrives, an endless cycle that never allows you to catch up, never provides the satisfaction of completion. Children, no matter how small, aren't spared. They might be set to picking oakum, pulling apart old tarred ropes for hours on end until their tiny fingers bleed. Or they could be sent to weaving, sorting, or hauling small loads across the yard. The oakum picking begins each morning after the children's meager breakfast. Old ship's ropes, thick as a man's wrist, coated with tar, and hardened by years of salt and sun, are distributed among the young workers. Each child receives a length of rope and a simple instruction. Pull it apart, fiber by fiber, until nothing remains but loose hemp. The work destroys small hands quickly. The tar, dried and brittle, cuts into soft palms. The hemp fibers are coarse and sharp, pricking and scraping with every motion. Children as young as 6 years old sit in rows, their fingers working constantly, picking and pulling and separating until their fingertips crack and bleed. The oakum produced by this labor has some value. It's used for caulking ships and sealing joints in construction. But the children see none of the profit from their work. They only see the pain, the endless repetition, the way their hands become gnarled and scarred before they've even learned to write their names properly. Some children are assigned to the spinning room, where cotton must be drawn out into thread. The work requires delicate touch and constant attention. Fingers must guide the cotton through the machinery without allowing it to bunch or break. The spinning wheels turn constantly, creating a hypnotic drone that fills the room, punctuated only by the snap of breaking thread and the quiet sobs of exhausted children. Others sort rags, separating usable cloth from waste, organizing materials by color and quality. The rags arrive in enormous bundles, compressed and often damp, smelling of their previous lives in homes and workplaces throughout the city. Children dig through these piles with their bare hands, never knowing what they might find. Sometimes there are coins, lost buttons, forgotten trinkets. These treasures must be surrendered immediately to the overseer. Keeping even the smallest discovery means punishment. The youngest children, those barely old enough to walk steadily, are often assigned to carrying tasks. They transport bundles of sorted materials from room to room, deliver messages between supervisors, clear away waste and debris. Their small legs carry them up and down stone staircases hundreds of times each day. Their arms strain under loads that seem impossibly heavy for their size. And all of this continues day after day. By midday, you're called inside for dinner. Another bowl of gruel, sometimes with a crust of stale bread if the workhouse is feeling generous. The midday meal follows the same rigid pattern as breakfast. Bell rings. Workers drop their tools where they stand. Lines form quickly, silently, in order of arrival at the dining hall. No one speaks, no one complains. No one dares to hope for anything different. The dining hall itself is a monument to institutional efficiency. Long wooden tables, scarred by years of use, stretch the length of the room. Backless benches provide seating for dozens at a time. The walls are bare stone, the windows high and narrow, designed to provide light without offering any view of the world beyond these walls. Your spot at the table is determined by your classification within the workhouse hierarchy. Able-bodied men sit closest to the servers, receiving their portions first. Women follow, then the elderly, then children. Each group waits its turn in silence, watching as the ladle dips into the large pot, measuring out exactly the prescribed amount for each person. The gruel at midday is sometimes slightly thicker than the morning portion, though whether this represents genuine improvement or merely the result of prolonged cooking is impossible to determine. It tastes of nothing but sustenance, designed to provide the minimum calories necessary to fuel afternoon labor. The bread, when it appears, is gray and dense, often several days old, sometimes spotted with mold that must be carefully scraped away. Eating must be completed within the allotted time, 15 minutes from the first person served to the last spoon collected. Conversation remains forbidden. The only sounds are the scraping of metal against tin, the occasional cough or sniffle, the steady footsteps of supervisors patrolling between the tables. Some inmates eat with desperate speed, fearful that their portions might be taken away before they're finished. Others eat slowly, trying to make the meager meal last as long as possible, knowing it will be many hours before food appears again. Both approaches are watched carefully by the staff, noted as potential signs of trouble or discontent. When the meal ends, bowls and spoons are collected and counted. Nothing can go missing. Nothing can be hidden or saved for later. The transition back to afternoon labor begins immediately. No time allowed for digestion or rest. There's no conversation at meals. Talking is discouraged. Laughter is unheard of. The silence imposed during meals extends far beyond simple quiet. It represents a systematic attempt to strip away one of humanity's most basic social needs: communication, connection, the sharing of experience through words. In the world beyond the workhouse walls, meals are social occasions, times for families to gather, for friends to share news, for communities to strengthen their bonds. Here, eating becomes a solitary act performed in the presence of others, a ritual of isolation disguised as communal activity. The prohibition against conversation serves multiple purposes in the minds of those who designed the workhouse system. First, it maintains order and control. Conversations can lead to complaints, complaints to organizing, organizing to resistance. Better to eliminate the possibility entirely than to risk the spread of dissatisfaction or revolutionary ideas. Second, silence reinforces the shame that the system wants inmates to feel. Talking implies that you have something worth saying, that your thoughts and experiences matter, that you deserve to be heard. The workhouse philosophy holds that poverty itself is evidence of moral failing, that those who have fallen into destitution have forfeited their right to dignity and consideration. Silence becomes both punishment and reminder of their supposedly diminished status. The absence of laughter cuts even deeper. Laughter represents joy, hope, the ability to find light in darkness. It connects people across differences of age, background, and circumstance. It suggests that life contains possibilities beyond mere survival, that human beings are capable of rising above their immediate circumstances through humor and shared understanding. By eliminating laughter, the workhouse attempts to eliminate hope itself. If you cannot find anything to laugh about, if you cannot share moments of lightness with those around you, then perhaps you will accept that this gray existence is all you deserve, all you should expect from life. The supervisors who enforce these rules of silence understand their power. They watch for whispered conversations, for shared glances that might indicate communication, for any sign that inmates are connecting with one another as human beings, rather than simply enduring as isolated individuals. Violations bring swift punishment: reduced food rations, extended work hours, solitary confinement, or assignment to the most unpleasant tasks available. After dinner, the routine resumes. More labor, more supervision, more silence. The afternoon work period stretches endlessly, particularly during winter, when darkness falls early and the cold becomes even more bitter. Whatever task occupied your morning continues without pause, with the added weight of fatigue and hunger settling into your bones. The thin gruel provides little energy for sustained physical labor, and by afternoon, most workers are operating on willpower alone. For those breaking stones, the afternoon brings additional challenges. Hands that were merely cold in the morning are now completely numb. Blisters that formed during the first hours of work have burst and begun bleeding. The hammer feels heavier with each strike, the stones more resistant to breaking. Some men develop a rhythm that allows them to continue working, even as their bodies shut down, their movements becoming automatic, unconscious, driven by fear of punishment rather than any conscious effort. Women in the laundry face their own afternoon trials. The water in the washing tubs has grown colder throughout the day, and their hands, already raw from morning scrubbing, can barely grip the soap. Wet clothes feel impossibly heavy, and the simple act of wringing water from fabric becomes an exercise in endurance. Many women develop permanent damage to their hands and wrists from this work. Joints that swell and stiffen, fingers that lose their ability to grasp properly. Children suffer, perhaps most of all, during the afternoon hours. Their small bodies, already pushed beyond reasonable limits during the morning, begin to fail them completely. Some fall asleep while working, their heads nodding over piles of oakum or spinning wheels. These moments of unconsciousness bring immediate punishment, usually in the form of sharp words, reduced rations, or assignment to standing tasks that make sleep impossible. The afternoon is also when illness most commonly manifests itself. Bodies weakened by poor nutrition and constant cold finally succumb to the diseases that flourish in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Coughing fits interrupt the rhythm of work. Fevers cause workers to stumble and collapse. Stomach ailments, brought on by the poor quality of food and water, send people running for the primitive toilet facilities. But sickness brings no respite from labor. Only the most obviously dying are excused from work, and even then, they receive reduced rations as punishment for their inability to contribute. Most people work through illness, spreading their conditions to others, creating cycles of infection that sweep through the workhouse like waves. The supervisors during afternoon hours are often more irritable than their morning counterparts. They too are affected by the cold, the dreariness, the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Some take out their frustrations on the workers under their supervision, finding fault with productivity levels, imposing additional tasks, or threatening punishments for infractions both real and imagined. As the sun begins to set, though on many days you wouldn't notice, you're marched back to the dormitory. The same cold room, the same thin blanket. The transition from work to sleep represents one of the day's few moments of potential relief. Yet even this basic human need becomes another exercise in institutional control. The evening bell rings precisely at the appointed hour, regardless of whether tasks have been completed to satisfaction. Workers must abandon their tools immediately, forming lines for the march back to dormitories. The walk through the workhouse corridors at day's end reveals the full scope of the institution's oppressive architecture. Long hallways stretch seemingly forever, lined with doors that lead to rooms you'll never see, occupied by people you'll never meet. The separation of sexes, ages, and circumstances is complete and absolute. Husbands don't see wives. Parents are kept from children. The elderly disappear into their own sections, becoming invisible reminders of what awaits those who survive long enough to grow old in this place. Your dormitory, when you finally reach it, offers no comfort and little privacy. Beds, if they can be called that, are arranged in precise rows, each exactly the same distance from its neighbors. The mattresses are thin straw pallets, often damp from poor ventilation and frequently infested with lice and other vermin. Blankets are distributed according to strict ratios, one per person, never more, regardless of the weather or individual need. The room itself provides no escape from the day's hardships. Stone walls radiate cold rather than warmth. Windows, few and small, let in drafts but little light. The ceiling is high and unheated, creating a space that never feels welcoming or secure. Sound carries easily from bed to bed, meaning that every cough, every sob, every restless movement becomes part of the collective experience of sleeplessness. Personal possessions are virtually non-existent. The clothes you wear are owned by the workhouse, assigned based on size and availability rather than preference or comfort. Any personal items you might have brought with you have long since been confiscated, sold, or lost. Your bed contains nothing but the standard issue blanket and pillow, both stamped with the workhouse mark to prevent theft. The evening routine includes mandatory washing, though the facilities are primitive and the water often cold. A row of basins provides space for dozens of people to wash simultaneously, with minimal privacy and no hot water. Soap, when available, is the same harsh mixture used for laundry, suitable for removing dirt, but hard on already damaged skin. Some nights, there might be a service or a scripture reading, but there's little comfort in it. Just more instructions to be obedient, grateful, and God-fearing. The religious services imposed upon workhouse inmates represent perhaps the cruelest irony of the entire system. These gatherings, mandatory for all but the seriously ill, take place in chapels that are as cold and unwelcoming as every other space in the building. Hard wooden pews provide uncomfortable seating for congregations that have no choice but to attend. The services themselves bear little resemblance to the comforting spiritual experiences that religion can provide in other circumstances. The clergymen who conduct these gatherings are often chosen more for their willingness to support the workhouse philosophy than for their pastoral skills or genuine concern for the welfare of their forced congregation. Sermons focus relentlessly on themes of moral failure, divine punishment, and the need for grateful acceptance of one's fate. Biblical passages are selected carefully to reinforce the message that poverty represents God's judgment upon the wicked, that suffering in this life is deserved punishment for sins both known and unknown. The promise of heavenly reward for earthly suffering is offered, but only to those who accept their circumstances without complaint or resistance. The hymns chosen for these services emphasize submission, repentance, and acceptance of authority. Songs of joy, celebration, or divine love are notably absent from the repertoire. Instead, inmates are required to sing about their own unworthiness, their gratitude for even the harsh mercy shown to them, their determination to accept whatever treatment they receive as part of God's plan for their improvement. Scripture readings are similarly selective, drawing primarily from passages that emphasize obedience to authority, acceptance of hardship, and the dangers of pride or discontent. The stories of biblical figures who challenged unjust systems, who fought for the oppressed, or who questioned authority are carefully avoided. Only those passages that support the existing power structure are deemed appropriate for workhouse congregations. Prayer time becomes another exercise in institutional control. Inmates are required to pray for their benefactors, to express gratitude for their care, to ask for divine assistance in becoming more productive and compliant workers. Personal prayers, individual spiritual needs, and private conversations with the divine are discouraged or forbidden entirely. The religious education provided to children in the workhouse follows similar patterns. Biblical stories are edited to emphasize obedience and acceptance rather than justice or compassion. Children learn to recite passages about honoring authority, figures, and accepting whatever treatment they receive as part of God's will. The revolutionary aspects of Christian teaching, the emphasis on caring for the poor and challenging unjust systems, are completely absent from their religious instruction. Disease spreads easily here. Coughs echo through the night. Some people never wake up again. The health conditions within Victorian workhouses represent one of the most damning aspects of the entire system. Designed with institutional efficiency rather than human welfare in mind, these buildings become breeding grounds for every form of illness that can afflict people living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Respiratory diseases flourish in the cold, damp atmosphere of the dormitories. Tuberculosis, the great killer of the Victorian era, finds perfect conditions for transmission among people whose resistance has been weakened by poor nutrition and constant stress. The disease spreads from person to person through shared air, contaminated bedding, and close contact that cannot be avoided in crowded sleeping quarters. The sound of coughing becomes the soundtrack of workhouse nights. It begins with one person, perhaps someone who seemed healthy during the day's labor. But as darkness falls and bodies cool from the day's exertion, the coughing starts. Deep, wet coughs that speak of fluid in the lungs. Dry, hacking coughs that suggest inflammation and infection. The sound carries from bed to bed, a reminder that illness is always present, always waiting to claim the next victim. Pneumonia strikes particularly hard during winter months, when the combination of cold air, inadequate heating, and physical exhaustion creates ideal conditions for the disease to take hold. People who seemed merely tired during evening roll call are found unconscious or delirious by morning, their bodies finally surrendering to infections they've been fighting for days or weeks. Digestive ailments are equally common, brought on by contaminated water supplies, poor food quality, and primitive sanitation facilities. Dysentery sweeps through workhouse populations regularly, causing severe dehydration and death among those whose bodies are already weakened by malnutrition. The primitive toilet facilities, often little more than open pits or shared buckets, ensure that these diseases spread quickly throughout the institution. Skin conditions are universal among long-term workhouse residents. Scabies, spread through shared bedding and close contact, causes intense itching and open sores that become infected in the unsanitary conditions. Lice infestations are so common as to be almost universal, and the harsh soaps used for cleaning do little to eliminate these parasites, while doing considerable damage to already compromised skin. The medical care available within workhouses is minimal at best. Most institutions employ a single doctor, often one whose skills or reputation make him unsuitable for private practice. These physicians are expected to treat hundreds of patients with minimal resources, no modern medications, and little support staff. Many common conditions that might be easily treatable in other circumstances become fatal in the workhouse environment. The infirmary, where it exists, is usually just another dormitory with slightly more space between beds. There are no modern medical instruments, no surgical facilities, no means of isolation for contagious patients. The seriously ill lie alongside those suffering from minor ailments, ensuring that infections spread and worsen rather than heal. Death is a constant presence in the workhouse. Bodies that finally succumb to the combination of poor nutrition, hard labor, inadequate shelter, and disease are removed quietly, usually during night hours, to avoid disturbing the routine of the living. Burial is quick and anonymous, in unmarked graves in potter's fields, with no ceremony beyond the minimum required by law. And still, the system moves on. The machinery of the workhouse operates with ruthless efficiency, grinding through human lives with the same mechanical precision applied to industrial production. Individual suffering is irrelevant to the larger purpose of the institution. People are processed like raw materials, sorted by category, assigned to tasks based on their perceived utility, discarded when they are no longer productive. Records are kept meticulously, but they focus on administrative details rather than human outcomes. How many pounds of oakum were produced this week? How many loads of laundry were processed? How much did food costs increase or decrease compared to the previous month? These are the measures that matter to those who run the system. The fate of individuals within the system is noted only when it affects these larger calculations. A death is recorded because it means one less mouth to feed, one less body requiring a bed, one less worker available for tomorrow's labor. A birth is noted because it represents an additional cost, another burden on the institution's resources. Recovery from illness matters only because it means a return to productive work. New inmates arrive regularly, often in family groups that are immediately separated according to the institution's rigid classification system. Husbands and wives are sent to different sections of the building. Children over a certain age are removed from their mothers and housed with other young workers. The elderly are segregated into their own areas, out of sight and largely forgotten. Each new arrival goes through the same processing routine. Personal possessions are confiscated and cataloged, though few are ever returned. Hair is cut short for easier maintenance and to reduce the spread of lice. Individual clothing is replaced with workhouse uniforms, identical garments that eliminate any expression of personal identity or preference. Names become numbers in the record books. Personal histories are reduced to simple categories: previous occupation, reason for admission, ability to work. Family relationships are noted only when they affect housing assignments or work details. Everything that once made these people unique individuals is systematically erased, replaced by institutional classifications that serve administrative convenience rather than human dignity. For those trapped inside during the winter months, survival isn't about living well. It's about enduring, about counting down the endless gray days until the chill starts to lift. Winter in the workhouse becomes an exercise in pure endurance. a test of how much suffering the human body and spirit can absorb before finally surrendering. The cold becomes an entity unto itself, a constant companion that never leaves, never provides respite, never allows even the briefest moment of warmth or comfort. The stone buildings that house these institutions are designed for durability rather than habitability. Thick walls that might provide insulation in a properly heated building instead become thermal masses that absorb and radiate cold. High ceilings, efficient for accommodating large numbers of people, create vast spaces that can never be adequately warmed by the minimal heating sources available. Windows, few and poorly fitted, provide points where outside cold can penetrate directly into living spaces. The single-pane glass offers no barrier to winter temperatures, and the frames, often warped by age and poor maintenance, allow drafts to flow freely throughout the dormitories and work areas. The clothing provided by the workhouse offers little protection against these conditions. Thin woolen garments, often patched and repatched, provide some insulation, but are rarely adequate for the sustained cold exposure that inmates experience. Shoes, when provided, are poorly fitted and offer little protection against cold floors and frozen ground. Sleep becomes elusive during the coldest months. Bodies that have been pushed to their limits during daylight hours struggle to find warmth enough for rest. People huddle under their single blankets, drawing their knees to their chests, trying to conserve whatever body heat they can generate. Some share beds illegally, risking punishment for the chance to combine their warmth. The sounds of winter suffering fill the dormitories each night, teeth chattering in uncontrollable rhythms. The rustle of straw as people shift constantly, seeking positions that might offer slightly more warmth. Quiet sobbing from those who have reached the limits of their endurance. And always, the wind outside, reminding everyone that the cold extends far beyond these walls, that there is no escape from winter's grip. Frostbite becomes common among those assigned to outdoor work. Fingers and toes, already weakened by poor circulation and inadequate nutrition, succumb quickly to freezing temperatures. The pain begins as tingling, progresses to burning, and finally to the dangerous numbness that signals tissue death. Many workhouse inmates bear the permanent scars of winter work. Shortened fingers, missing toes, hands that never regain full function. The psychological effects of prolonged cold exposure are equally devastating. The human spirit, like the human body, requires warmth to flourish. Constant cold creates a state of chronic stress that affects every aspect of mental and emotional functioning. People become withdrawn, focused solely on the immediate need to survive the next hour, the next day, the next bitter night. Hope becomes impossible to maintain when every moment brings fresh reminders of powerlessness and suffering. The simple act of waking each morning requires enormous effort. When sleep has provided no rest, and the day ahead promises only more of the same hardships that filled yesterday. But even then, spring doesn't bring much relief. It just means lighter clothes for the same heavy work. The arrival of warmer weather, which might represent salvation in any normal circumstances, provides only marginal improvement in workhouse conditions. The systematic nature of the oppression means that seasonal changes affect only the surface aspects of daily life, while leaving the fundamental structure of suffering intact. As temperatures rise, the heavy winter garments are replaced with lighter clothing, but the garments themselves remain equally poor in quality and fit. Summer clothes are often more threadbare than winter woolens, having seen longer service and more frequent washing. The slight relief from heavy fabric is offset by increased exposure to sun and weather during outdoor work assignments. The workload, rather than decreasing with improved conditions, often intensifies during warmer months. Stone breaking continues at the same pace, but now workers must contend with heat exhaustion and sunburn, in addition to the physical demands of the labor. The laundry work becomes somewhat easier on the hands, but more exhausting overall as the washing rooms become sweltering in summer heat. New challenges emerge with warmer weather. Insects become a constant torment, particularly in dormitories, where large numbers of people sleep in close proximity. Fleas, bedbugs, and mosquitoes thrive in the warm, crowded conditions, adding sleeplessness and constant itching to the catalog of daily miseries. The food, never good, becomes even more problematic in warm weather. Without refrigeration, the already poor quality ingredients used in workhouse kitchens spoil more quickly. The gruel, thin and unappetizing in winter, becomes rancid and sometimes dangerous in summer heat. Stomach ailments increase, adding to the health burdens that inmates already carry. Water supplies, always questionable, become more contaminated during warm months. The primitive sanitation systems cannot handle the increased bacterial growth that comes with higher temperatures, and waterborne diseases spread more rapidly through the workhouse population. The buildings themselves, designed to contain and control rather than comfort, become oppressive in different ways during summer months. The thick stone walls that radiated cold in winter now trap heat, creating stifling conditions in dormitories and work areas. The high windows, positioned to prevent views of the outside world, also prevent proper ventilation, creating stagnant air that becomes increasingly difficult to breathe. The workhouse wasn't designed to help people thrive. It was designed to remind them, again and again, that poverty was their failing, that hunger and cold were their punishments. The philosophical foundation upon which the entire workhouse system rested represented one of the most profound moral failures of Victorian society. The ideology that shaped these institutions was built upon fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of poverty, the causes of economic hardship, and the relationship between individual worth and material circumstances. The prevailing belief among those who designed and supported the workhouse system was that poverty resulted primarily from moral failings, rather than economic or social conditions beyond individual control. This worldview held that people became destitute because they were lazy, immoral, improvident, or otherwise personally defective. The logical extension of this belief was that poverty itself served as evidence of character flaws that needed to be corrected through harsh treatment and rigorous discipline. This moral framework conveniently ignored the economic realities that actually drove most people into destitution. Industrial changes that eliminated traditional forms of employment, seasonal fluctuations in agricultural work, economic depressions that closed factories and reduced wages, illness or injury that prevented people from working. All these circumstances were treated as irrelevant to the question of individual responsibility. The workhouse system was explicitly designed to be less attractive than any form of independent living, no matter how harsh. This principle, known as less eligibility, meant that conditions within these institutions had to be worse than the worst, circumstances that free laborers might experience. The logic was that if workhouse life were too comfortable, people would choose institutional care over independent work, creating a burden on taxpayers and removing incentives for self-sufficiency. In practice, this meant that workhouse conditions had to be deliberately cruel, systematically oppressive, designed to cause suffering rather than alleviate it. The institutions became laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance, places where the goal was not to help people recover and return to productive lives, but to punish them for their perceived failures and deter others from seeking similar assistance. The separation of families served multiple purposes within this ideological framework. It punished people for becoming dependent by destroying their most important relationships. It prevented the formation of mutual support networks that might make workhouse life more bearable. It eliminated any sense of privacy or personal autonomy that might allow people to maintain their dignity and self-respect. The meaningless labor assigned to inmates was another deliberate feature of the punishment system. Work that produced nothing useful, that served no purpose beyond exhausting the worker, reinforced the message that the inmates themselves were useless, that their labor had no value, that they deserved nothing better than futile exertion. Even the architecture of workhouse buildings reflected the underlying philosophy of punishment and deterrence. The fortress-like appearance of these structures was intended to intimidate and demoralize both inmates and potential applicants. The high walls, small windows, and institutional appearance sent clear messages about the status of those confined within. The dining arrangements, dormitory layouts, and work assignments all served the same purpose: to strip away every aspect of normal human social interaction, to reduce complex individuals to simple economic units, to eliminate any possibility that people might find comfort, dignity, or hope within the system designed to contain them. And so, as you lay down on that hard bench, pulling your thin blanket tighter, listening to the distant sound of boots on stone floors, you wonder if you'll even feel your toes in the morning. The final moments of each workhouse day brought their own particular form of torment. Lying on the narrow, uncomfortable sleeping surface, surrounded by the sounds and smells of dozens of other people in similar circumstances, the full weight of the situation would settle upon each person like a physical burden. The thin blanket, barely adequate even for mild weather, became a cruel joke during winter months. No matter how tightly you pulled it around your body, no matter how you positioned yourself to minimize exposed skin, the cold found its way through every gap, every loose thread, every worn spot in the fabric. The bench beneath you offered no cushioning, no accommodation for the natural curves of the human body. The wood, worn smooth by countless previous occupants, provided a surface that was simultaneously too hard and too narrow. Every position became uncomfortable within minutes. Lying on your back meant pressure on spine and shoulder blades. Turning to your side concentrated all your weight on hip and shoulder, creating pressure points that would ache for hours. Sleep, when it came at all, was fitful and unsatisfying. The combination of physical discomfort, constant cold, and psychological stress made deep rest impossible. You might drift into unconsciousness for brief periods, only to be awakened by your own shivering, by the coughing of a neighbor, by the sound of someone crying quietly in the darkness. The sounds of the night created their own form of torture. Every cough suggested disease that might spread to you. Every sob reminded you of your own barely controlled despair. The creaking of wooden benches as people shifted position, seeking comfort that would never come, provided a rhythmic soundtrack to sleeplessness. But perhaps most disturbing were the boots on stone floors. The supervisors never truly slept, never abandoned their vigilance. Throughout the night, footsteps echoed through the corridors as guards made their rounds, checking for rule violations, listening for conversations, ensuring that even in sleep, the inmates remained under constant surveillance. These footsteps carried different meanings depending on their pattern and timing. Slow, regular steps usually indicated routine patrols, the normal monitoring that continued around the clock. Faster steps might mean someone had been discovered breaking rules, perhaps sharing beds for warmth, or attempting to communicate with family members in other sections of the building. The most frightening footsteps were those that stopped. When the regular rhythm of boots on stone ceased outside your dormitory, everyone within earshot would freeze, hardly daring to breathe. The silence that followed could mean anything: a supervisor listening for unauthorized conversation, a search for missing items, or simply a guard pausing to warm himself before continuing his rounds. Sometimes the footsteps would be accompanied by other sounds that spoke of individual tragedies unfolding within the workhouse walls. The creaking of doors opening in the middle of the night often meant that someone had become too ill to remain in the general dormitory. The sound of multiple sets of feet might indicate that a body was being removed, another victim claimed by the conditions that made survival so precarious. For many, the answer was no. Morning after morning, people would be found who had not survived the night. Some had simply succumbed to the combination of cold, malnutrition, and exhaustion that characterized workhouse life. Others had been claimed by specific diseases that flourished in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. A few, driven beyond the limits of psychological endurance, had found their own ways to escape the endless cycle of suffering. The discovery of a death during morning roll call was handled with the same administrative efficiency that characterized every other aspect of workhouse operations. The body would be noted in the daily records, along with any personal effects that might need to be cataloged. The space would be prepared for the next occupant, who might arrive that very day. There were no memorial services, no moments of recognition for lives that had ended in these circumstances. The person who had slept on the bench beside you, who had shared the same meager meals and performed the same meaningless labor, would simply disappear from the daily routine as if they had never existed. The survivors learned not to form attachments, not to invest emotionally in relationships that could be ended so suddenly and completely. This emotional numbing became another survival mechanism, a way of protecting whatever remained of the human spirit against the constant threat of loss and abandonment. Yet even this psychological armor came at a cost. The ability to care about others, to find meaning in human connection, to maintain hope for better circumstances. All of these essential human capacities were gradually eroded by the systematic dehumanization of workhouse life. Some people developed a kind of institutional fatalism, accepting that their lives had been reduced to mere biological survival, that each day successfully completed was a small victory against forces determined to destroy them. Others maintained fierce internal resistance, nursing private dreams of escape or revenge, keeping alive some spark of rebellion that the system could not quite extinguish. And yet, for most people outside these walls, the suffering inside remained invisible. The stone buildings sat quietly in the middle of towns and cities, their cold routines unfolding behind closed doors. The workhouses were designed to be invisible in plain sight, prominent enough to serve as warnings to the potentially destitute, but sufficiently removed from daily life that comfortable citizens could ignore the realities within their walls. These institutions occupied a strange position in Victorian social geography, simultaneously central to the community's approach to poverty and marginal to the everyday experience of most residents. The buildings themselves contributed to this invisibility through their architectural design. High walls surrounded the complexes, preventing casual observation of daily activities within. Windows were positioned and sized to provide minimal views either into or out of the workhouse grounds. Entrances were typically located away from main thoroughfares, requiring visitors to make deliberate efforts to approach the institution. The timing of workhouse activities was coordinated to minimize public exposure to the inmates. Labor that might be performed outdoors was scheduled during hours when most citizens were occupied with their own work. Exercise periods, when they existed at all, took place in enclosed yards that could not be observed from public streets. Even the movement of people into and out of the workhouse was managed to reduce public visibility. Admissions typically occurred during early morning or late evening hours. Bodies of those who died within the institution were removed during nighttime, transported to burial sites through routes that avoided main streets and commercial areas. This systematic invisibility served multiple purposes for Victorian society. It allowed people of means to maintain comfortable beliefs about the effectiveness and humanity of their approach to poverty relief. They could support the workhouse system in principle while remaining ignorant of its practical realities. The suffering of the inmates became an abstraction, a necessary evil that existed only in theory rather than lived experience. The physical separation also prevented the formation of sympathetic connections between inmates and the broader community. If the poor remained hidden, if their stories went untold, if their humanity was obscured by institutional walls, then it became easier to view them as fundamentally different from ordinary citizens, deserving of their fate rather than victims of circumstance. Local newspapers rarely reported on conditions within workhouses, treating these institutions as necessary but unremarkable parts of the social infrastructure. When stories did appear, they typically focused on administrative matters rather than human experiences, budget discussions, staffing changes, or policy modifications rather than the daily realities of institutional life. The few people who might have regular contact with workhouse inmates, delivery personnel, visiting clergy, occasional inspectors, were either too few in number to significantly influence public opinion, or were themselves invested in maintaining the system that provided their employment or validated their social beliefs. This conspiracy of silence and invisibility was so effective that many Victorian citizens could live their entire lives within miles of a workhouse without ever seeing an inmate, hearing their stories, or confronting the reality of what was being done in their names and with their tax money. But then, something began to change. The transformation in public awareness of workhouse conditions did not happen overnight, nor did it result from any single dramatic revelation. Instead, it emerged gradually through the intersection of several social and cultural developments that made the invisible visible, that gave voice to the voiceless, that challenged comfortable assumptions about poverty and social responsibility. The growth of literacy among working-class populations meant that more people could read accounts of workhouse conditions when they became available. The expansion of newspaper circulation brought stories of institutional life to broader audiences. The development of investigative journalism created new opportunities for reporters to examine social conditions that had previously been ignored or concealed. At the same time, changing religious attitudes began to challenge the moral framework that justified harsh treatment of the poor. New theological movements emphasized social justice and charitable responsibility, questioning whether poverty truly represented divine punishment for individual failings. Religious leaders began to speak more forcefully about society's obligations to care for its most vulnerable members. Political reforms were also creating opportunities for working-class voices to be heard in ways that had been impossible earlier in the century. Labor organizations, reform societies, and political movements began to articulate alternative approaches to poverty relief, challenging the assumptions upon which the workhouse system was based. The economic prosperity of mid-Victorian Britain was creating a growing middle class that had both the leisure to concern itself with social issues and the financial security to support reform movements. These citizens, neither wealthy enough to be completely insulated from economic anxiety, nor poor enough to risk workhouse admission themselves, became a crucial constituency for social change. Cultural shifts were also making it more difficult to ignore the humanity of the poor. Romantic literature had begun to celebrate the nobility of common people, while emerging social sciences were providing new frameworks for understanding the structural causes of poverty and inequality. One man who had seen poverty up close as a child decided to write about it. He took the silence and filled it with words. He gave faces to the forgotten and voices to the voiceless. Charles Dickens had experienced the terror of destitution firsthand, though few knew it during the early years of his literary career. At age 12, while his father languished in debtor's prison, young Charles had been sent to work in a blacking factory, pasting labels on bottles of shoe polish for 10 hours a day. The shame of this experience, the fear of falling back into such circumstances, and the intimate knowledge of how quickly respectability could dissolve into desperation would drive his writing for the rest of his life. Unlike the comfortable reformers who approached poverty as an intellectual exercise or moral crusade, Dickens wrote from a place of personal understanding. He knew the smell of cheap lodging houses, the gnawing sensation of constant hunger, the humiliation of being treated as less than human because of economic circumstances beyond his control. This knowledge gave his fictional portrayals an authenticity and emotional power that purely theoretical approaches could never achieve. But Dickens also possessed something that most people who had experienced such poverty lacked: exceptional literary talent, social connections that could help him reach influential audiences, and the financial success that allowed him to speak freely without fear of retaliation. He could serve as a bridge between the world of the comfortable and the world of the desperate, translating experiences that were invisible to most Victorian readers into stories that were impossible to ignore. His approach to social criticism through fiction was revolutionary in its accessibility and emotional impact. Rather than writing theoretical treatises about economic policy or moral philosophy, he created characters whose struggles and sufferings readers could understand and empathize with. He made abstract social problems personal and immediate, forcing his audience to confront the human consequences of systems they might otherwise support in principle. The serialized nature of much Victorian fiction, including many of Dickens' most famous works, meant that his social criticism was delivered in installments that built emotional investment over time. Readers who followed the monthly adventures of Oliver Twist or the weekly episodes of Hard Times found themselves increasingly engaged with characters whose fates depended upon the very social institutions that these readers might support or oppose. Dickens understood that changing social conditions required changing hearts and minds, not just passing new legislation or modifying administrative procedures. His fiction worked to create emotional connections between readers and the poor, to humanize people who had been reduced to statistics or stereotypes, to demonstrate that the victims of social injustice were individuals with hopes, fears, dreams, and dignity, rather than simply economic burdens or moral failures. So now, let's step away from the freezing dormitories and into the study of Charles Dickens, a man whose stories would help Victorian Britain see what it had long tried to ignore. In the warmth of his writing room, surrounded by the tools of his trade and driven by memories that never quite left him, he would craft tales that would pierce the veil of institutional invisibility and expose the human cost of a society's indifference to its most vulnerable members. Through the power of story, he would transform the silence of the workhouse into a voice that could not be ignored, creating a literary revolution that would forever change how we understand the relationship between individual suffering and social responsibility. Picture a narrow street in London during the early 1800s. The air is thick with chimney smoke that clings to everything like a second skin, staining the brick facades of cramped tenements and coating the windows in a perpetual film of soot. Horses clatter along cobblestones, their hooves splashing through puddles from last night's rain, creating a rhythmic percussion that mingles with the cacophony of urban life. Merchants shout over each other from their stalls, hawking everything from day-old bread to mysterious tonics promising miraculous cures. Street children dart between carts, some selling newspapers with ink still wet from the presses, others simply looking for scraps of food dropped by hurried pedestrians or discarded by those fortunate enough to have more than they need. The Thames flows nearby, its waters brown and sluggish, carrying the waste of 1,000,000 souls and the dreams of countless more. Factory smokestacks pierce the sky like blackened fingers, reaching toward clouds that seem perpetually gray. Church bells ring the hours, their bronze voices competing with the hammering from workshops, the crying of vendors, and the constant rumble of iron wheels on stone. Somewhere in the midst of this noise and grayness, a young boy walks alone. His clothes are threadbare, patched and repatched until the original fabric has become a memory. His shoes, if he has any, are worn thin at the sole, offering little protection from the cold dampness that seeps up from the streets. Hunger twists in his stomach like a living thing, a constant companion that shapes his thoughts and drives his steps. Nights are spent in cold corners or beneath thin blankets that provide more psychological comfort than actual warmth, just like the children inside the workhouses, who huddle together for whatever meager heat their bodies can share. That boy was Charles Dickens. But before we follow young Charles into the depths of his formative struggle, we must understand the world that shaped him. London in the early 19th century was a city in violent transition. The Industrial Revolution had transformed what was once a manageable medieval town into a sprawling metropolis that seemed to grow by the hour. Factory owners grew rich while their workers lived in conditions that would have shocked their rural ancestors. The city's population had exploded, but its infrastructure lagged behind, creating a perfect storm of overcrowding, disease, and desperation. The poor were not merely disadvantaged. They were systematically oppressed by a society that viewed poverty as a moral failing rather than a systemic problem. The workhouse system, designed ostensibly to provide relief for the destitute, had evolved into something far more sinister. These institutions operated on the principle of less eligibility, which meant that conditions inside the workhouse had to be worse than the worst conditions outside, supposedly to discourage people from seeking help unless they were truly desperate. Dickens was born in 1812 into a family that often struggled with money. His father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, a position that should have provided a comfortable middle-class existence. But John had expensive tastes and little understanding of financial management. He lived as if his salary were twice what it actually was, borrowing against future earnings and making promises he couldn't keep. Charles's mother, Elizabeth, came from a family with pretensions to gentility, but little actual wealth to support those pretensions. The Dickens household was one of perpetual financial crisis, barely held at bay by optimism and creative accounting. Bills went unpaid for months. Landlords made increasingly threatening visits. Creditors appeared at the door with increasing frequency. Young Charles watched his parents navigate these treacherous waters with a mixture of charm, desperation, and delusion that would later inform his literary portraits of characters caught between social classes. When Charles was just 12 years old, the precarious balance finally collapsed. His father was arrested for debt and sent to Marshalsea Prison, a forbidding brick structure in Southwark where debtors were held until their obligations could be satisfied. In those days, when a parent was imprisoned for debt, the entire family often followed, living in cramped quarters inside the prison walls. The theory was that keeping families together was more humane than separating them, but the reality was that it simply concentrated misery in one location. For Dickens, this meant an abrupt end to his schooling and the start of a hard and lonely chapter that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While his family adapted to the reduced circumstances behind bars, making the best of prison life with the resilience that poverty often breeds, Charles faced a different fate. Rather than join his family in Marshalsea, he was sent to live in lodgings and work to contribute to the family's meager income. The work he found was in Warren's blacking factory, a grimy establishment located near the Thames, where shoe polish was manufactured and packaged. The building itself was old and decrepit, with floors that sagged under the weight of machinery and walls that wept with condensation. Windows were few and often broken, letting in London's perpetual drafts but little light. For long hours each day, Charles pasted labels onto bottles of shoe polish. The work was mind-numbingly dull and repetitive, requiring just enough attention to prevent mistakes, but not enough to engage his quick intelligence. His small hands grew stained with ink and glue. His back ached from bending over workbenches designed for adults. The factory smelled of chemicals and damp wood, a combination that would trigger vivid memories decades later when he caught similar scents on London streets. Rats scurried in dark corners, bold enough to venture out in daylight because they had learned that the workers were too busy or too tired to chase them away. The other boys there were rough, many having come from poorhouses or orphanages where survival depended on toughness rather than sensitivity. They spoke in dialects Charles barely understood, used words he had never heard, and played games that seemed designed to humiliate rather than entertain. Dickens felt abandoned and forgotten, cut off from the world he had known, and thrust into one where his education, his middle-class background, and his literary inclinations counted for nothing. In the factory, he was just another pair of hands, valued only for what he could produce. The class distinctions that had seemed so important in his family's social circle meant nothing here. He was poor, and poverty was the great equalizer. But it was also the great educator. During those months in the blacking factory, Charles learned lessons that no classroom could have taught him. He discovered what it meant to be hungry, not just for food, but for dignity, for hope, for the simple acknowledgement that his life had value beyond its economic productivity. He learned to recognize the signs of desperation in others' faces, to understand the calculations that poverty forces people to make, to appreciate the small kindnesses that cost nothing but mean everything. The neighborhood around the factory was a world unto itself. Narrow alleys twisted between buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. Laundry hung from windows like surrendered flags. Children played in gutters because there were no parks or playgrounds. Women sat on stoops, nursing babies while keeping watch over older children who scavenged for anything useful or valuable. Charles walked these streets every day, observing with the intensity that would later make him one of literature's great chroniclers of urban life. He saw how poverty shaped not just people's circumstances, but their characters. He witnessed acts of extraordinary generosity from people who had almost nothing, and stunning cruelty from those who should have known better. He learned that virtue and vice were not distributed according to social class, that the poor were neither inherently noble nor naturally vicious, but simply human beings trying to survive in impossible circumstances. The other workers at the factory became his unwitting teachers in the realities of working-class life. There was Bob Fagin, ironically sharing a surname with one of Dickens's most famous villains, who showed Charles small kindnesses and tried to protect him from the rougher boys. There was Paul Green, who could barely read but possessed a street wisdom that Charles envied. These relationships were complex, marked by the awkwardness of Charles's obvious differences from his coworkers and his own confusion about where he belonged in the social hierarchy. Evening brought little relief. Charles's lodgings were in a boarding house where privacy was a luxury and comfort was almost non-existent. He shared space with men who worked in various trades, all of them struggling to maintain their dignity while living in conditions that seemed designed to strip it away. Conversations over meager dinners revealed the precarious nature of working-class existence, where illness, injury, or economic downturn could instantly transform a respectable artisan into a pauper. These early experiences left deep marks on him that would never fully heal. Even as he grew older and found success as a journalist and novelist, memories of that cold, hungry time lingered like shadows at the edge of his consciousness. They shaped his view of society in fundamental ways, creating a perspective that combined intimate knowledge of poverty's realities with a middle-class sensibility that was appalled by those realities. The trauma of this period was compounded by its apparent endlessness. While his family's imprisonment was temporary, Charles's exile from his previous life seemed permanent. There was no indication that he would ever return to school, ever escape the factory, ever reclaim the future he had once imagined for himself. This sense of lost potential became a recurring theme in his work, appearing in characters who are denied opportunities, not because they lack ability or ambition, but because society's structures prevent them from realizing their capabilities. When his family was finally released from prison and Charles was rescued from the factory, the relief was complicated by lasting emotional damage. He had learned to see himself through the eyes of a society that valued him only for his economic output. The shame of this period stayed with him throughout his life, informing his understanding of how poverty affects not just material circumstances, but psychological well-being. The experience also gave him an almost supernatural sensitivity to the signs of economic distress in others. He could recognize the desperation hidden behind respectability, the calculations that people made when choosing between rent and food, a way poverty forced individuals to compromise their values simply to survive another day. This insight would become one of his greatest strengths as a writer, allowing him to create characters whose internal lives reflected the external pressures of their economic circumstances. They filled his stories with characters drawn from real life, people whose struggles he had witnessed firsthand during those formative months. The factory workers, the boarding house residents, the street children, the small-time criminals who lived in the margins of society, all found their way into his fiction, transformed by his imagination, but rooted in authentic observation. His family's experience in Marshalsea Prison also provided him with detailed knowledge of debtors' prison life that would inform several of his novels. He understood the peculiar social dynamics of prison communities, where conventional hierarchies were disrupted, but not entirely eliminated. He knew how families adapted to confinement, how children grew up behind bars, how the experience of imprisonment affected people's relationships with the outside world even after their release. More importantly, perhaps, he understood the arbitrary nature of economic disaster. His family's fall from middle-class respectability to imprisonment had happened quickly and without warning. This knowledge gave him a profound appreciation for the fragility of social position and the thin line that separated the comfortable from the desperate. It also bred in him a lifelong anxiety about financial security that would drive him to work compulsively even after he achieved considerable success. By the time Dickens began writing Oliver Twist in his mid-20s, he was determined to show his readers the truth about poverty in Victorian England. His childhood experiences had given him both the emotional motivation and the authentic detail necessary to create a work of unprecedented social realism. Unlike other novels of the time, which often romanticized hardship or avoided it altogether, Oliver Twist pulled back the curtain on a world that most middle-class readers preferred to ignore. The novel's approach was revolutionary in its unflinching examination of social problems. Previous literature had typically portrayed the poor as either noble sufferers whose virtue was enhanced by their trials, or as comic figures whose poverty was a source of humor rather than concern. Dickens rejected both of these approaches, instead presenting poverty as a systemic problem that destroyed lives and corrupted society. His decision to serialize the novel in Bentley's Miscellany was strategically brilliant. By publishing the story in monthly installments, he could build suspense while gradually exposing his readers to increasingly disturbing revelations about the conditions faced by the poor. Each installment ended with a cliffhanger that kept readers coming back, but also with images and ideas that lingered in their minds between issues. The character of Oliver, small and underfed, begins his story in a workhouse that Dickens based on careful observation of actual institutions. The infamous scene where Oliver dares to ask for more food was not just fiction, but a reflection of the grim reality thousands of real children faced. Hunger was constant in these places, a deliberate policy rather than an unfortunate circumstance. The workhouse governors believed that generous feeding would encourage dependency and attract undeserving poor who might otherwise find work. The psychological impact of chronic hunger on children was something Dickens understood from personal experience. He knew how it affected concentration, mood, and behavior. He understood how hungry children became obsessed with food, how they dreamed about meals, how they would risk punishment for even the smallest additional morsel. Oliver's famous request for more gruel was not an act of rebellion, but a moment of desperate need overcoming institutionalized intimidation. Dickens described the stale bread, the weak soup, the harsh taskmasters, and the complete lack of compassion that shaped these institutions with the accuracy of someone who had felt their effects. His descriptions of workhouse meals were particularly vivid because he knew what it meant to go to bed hungry, to wake up thinking about food, to have one's entire day structured around the anticipation of inadequate nourishment. The workhouse scenes also revealed Dickens's understanding of how institutions could systematically dehumanize their inhabitants. The uniforms, the regulations, the constant surveillance, the punishment of any sign of individuality all served to break down people's sense of self-worth and personal agency. Children in workhouses were not educated for useful trades, but trained for lives of servitude. They were taught to be grateful for whatever they received and never to expect more. He created characters like Mr. Bumble, the pompous workhouse beadle, to embody the petty tyranny that flourished in such institutions. Bumble was not evil in the melodramatic sense. but representative of a more insidious problem: the way that small amounts of power could corrupt ordinary people when exercised over those who had no recourse. Bumble's pomposity and self-importance reflected the attitudes of many officials who administered the workhouse system. People who genuinely believed that they were performing valuable social work while inflicting systematic cruelty. Fagin, the manipulative leader of a gang of child thieves, represented another aspect of how society failed its most vulnerable members. While Fagin was clearly a villain, Dickens was careful to show how the children in his gang had been driven to crime by circumstances beyond their control. They were not inherently criminal, but had been shaped by a society that offered them no legitimate opportunities. The relationship between Fagin and his young thieves reflected the reality of how criminal networks exploited abandoned children. Dickens had observed such relationships during his time in the factory neighborhood, where children without family protection often fell prey to adults who offered them food and shelter in exchange for participating in illegal activities. The criminal underworld provided a distorted version of the family structure that these children had been denied by society's failure to care for them properly. What made Dickens's writing different was its reach and its timing. Serialized in newspapers and magazines, his stories were read by people from all walks of life, but particularly by the growing middle class that had both the leisure to read fiction and the political influence to demand reform. Middle-class families who had never set foot near a workhouse suddenly found themselves reading detailed descriptions of starvation, forced labor, and child neglect over their comfortable breakfasts. The serial format also allowed Dickens to respond to reader reactions and current events. As public interest in social reform grew, he could incorporate new details and emphasize particular aspects of the problems he was exposing. The ongoing nature of the publication meant that readers lived with Oliver's story for months, allowing its themes to permeate their consciousness in ways that a single book might not have achieved. Conversations about poverty began taking place in drawing rooms and dinner parties where such topics had previously been considered inappropriate or unnecessarily unpleasant. Dickens had succeeded in making the conditions of the poor a matter of middle-class concern, not just through appeals to charity, but by demonstrating how poverty affected everyone in society. His readers came to understand that the social problems he described were not unfortunate accidents, but the predictable results of deliberate policies. Reformers used Dickens's stories to argue for change, quoting passages from Oliver Twist in parliamentary debates and Reform Society meetings. The novel provided them with vivid illustrations of abstract policy debates, making the human cost of social neglect impossible to ignore. Politicians who might have dismissed statistical reports about workhouse conditions found it much harder to dismiss the story of Oliver Twist. The book also introduced readers to the criminal underworld of London with unprecedented detail and sympathy. Pickpockets, swindlers, and corrupt officials all played their part in a complex ecosystem of urban crime that Dickens presented as both threatening and tragically inevitable. He showed how crime flourished in conditions of poverty and neglect, how the same social failures that filled workhouses also created criminals. His portrayal of London's criminal districts was based on extensive personal observation. As a journalist, he had walked through areas like Seven Dials and Saffron Hill, noting the conditions that bred crime and the relationships between legal and illegal activities. He understood how legitimate businesses often depended on criminal enterprises, how corruption connected the underworld to respectable society, how the boundaries between legal and illegal behavior were often blurred by economic necessity. Dickens wasn't just telling a story. He was documenting a system that pushed people toward desperation and then punished them for the predictable results of that desperation. His criminals were not romantic figures, but damaged people whose circumstances had limited their choices. Even Bill Sikes, the most violent character in the novel, was presented as a product of his environment rather than simply an evil individual. The novel's structure itself reflected Dickens's argument about social responsibility. Oliver's journey from workhouse to criminal gang to middle-class rescue was not just an individual story, but a demonstration of how society's institutions shaped individual destinies. The coincidences and melodramatic plot devices that some critics found unrealistic were actually Dickens's way of showing how arbitrarily social position was determined and how easily circumstances could change. Oliver Twist became a symbol not just of one child's suffering, but of an entire generation caught in a cycle of poverty and punishment. The novel's impact was immediate and lasting, influencing both public opinion and government policy. Within a few years of its publication, investigations into workhouse conditions led to reforms, though these changes were often more cosmetic than substantial. The character of Oliver himself became a cultural touchstone, representing innocent suffering and the possibility of redemption. But Dickens was careful to show that Oliver's rescue was exceptional rather than typical. For every Oliver who escaped his circumstances, countless other children remained trapped in the systems that had nearly destroyed him. Even years after the book's publication, Dickens continued to speak out about social issues with the authority of someone whose views had been shaped by personal experience. He visited workhouses regularly, not as a tourist, but as an investigator determined to document conditions and hold officials accountable. His descriptions of these visits, published in his journals and letters, showed that the problems he had highlighted in Oliver Twist persisted despite public attention. He toured prisons, examining the conditions under which society confined its criminals and debtors. His experiences in these institutions informed his later novels, particularly Little Dorrit, which drew heavily on his family's time in Marshalsea Prison. He understood how imprisonment affected not just the confined, but their families, how the shame and disruption of incarceration created lasting damage that extended far beyond the prison walls. Dickens wrote articles about what he saw during these investigations, using his celebrity status to draw attention to ongoing problems. His journalism was informed by the same combination of personal experience and careful observation that made his fiction so powerful. He could describe the psychological effects of poverty and confinement because he had felt them himself. But he could also analyze their social causes because he had studied them systematically. In speeches throughout his career, he called for compassion and reform with the passion of someone who had experienced society's failures firsthand. His advocacy was not based on abstract principles, but on intimate knowledge of how social systems affected real people. He could speak about the dignity of the poor because he had been poor, about the arbitrariness of social position because he had experienced traumatic changes in his own circumstances. Slowly, policies began to shift in response to public pressure that Dickens had helped to create. Though the workhouse system wouldn't disappear overnight, modifications to its operation made conditions somewhat less harsh. Child labor laws were strengthened, though enforcement remained inconsistent. Educational opportunities for poor children expanded, though access was still limited. These changes were incremental and often inadequate, but they represented a shift in public consciousness that Dickens had helped to create. The idea that society had a responsibility to care for its most vulnerable members gained acceptance, even if the implementation of that responsibility remained imperfect. Dickens's voice had added weight to the growing movement for change by providing it with powerful imagery and emotional resonance. The novelist's influence extended beyond specific policy reforms to broader changes in how people thought about social problems. His work helped establish the principle that literature could be a force for social change, that fiction could be a vehicle for serious moral and political argument. Future writers would follow his example in using their art to expose social problems and advocate for reform. And yet, for all his influence and success, Dickens never entirely shook the sadness of his own childhood. The months in the blacking factory had left psychological scars that never fully healed. He remained hypersensitive to any suggestion that his social position was insecure, working compulsively to ensure that he would never again face the kind of economic vulnerability that had defined his early life. Behind the sharp wit and rich descriptions in his novels was a man who never forgot what it felt like to be hungry, cold, and powerless. His charitable activities, his social advocacy, his literary output all bore the marks of someone trying to prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. The boy who had pasted labels on blacking bottles never entirely disappeared, remaining as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how arbitrary social distinctions really were. His later novels continued to explore themes of social justice and individual dignity, but always with the authority of someone who had experienced both prosperity and poverty, both inclusion and exclusion. The psychological complexity of his characters reflected his understanding that people were shaped by their circumstances, but not entirely determined by them, that individual agency existed within social constraints, but was never entirely free from them. The success of Oliver Twist established Dickens as more than just a popular entertainer. It made him a moral voice whose opinions carried weight in public debates. But this success also created pressures and expectations that sometimes conflicted with his personal needs and artistic vision. He was expected to be a spokesman for the poor, a role that he embraced, but that also limited his freedom to explore other themes and subjects. So the next time you hear the story of Oliver asking for more, you'll know it wasn't just a scene in a book. It was a quiet echo of millions of real voices, all asking for something better, all hoping that someone would hear their plea and respond with compassion rather than condescension. The bowl of gruel became a symbol of all the small dignities that poverty stripped away, and Oliver's courage in asking for more became a representation of the resilience that allows people to maintain their humanity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Dickens had given voice to those who were typically voiceless, had made visible those who were usually invisible, had demanded that society acknowledge the full humanity of those it preferred to ignore. His achievement was not just literary but moral, demonstrating that art could serve justice and that individual stories could illuminate universal truths. And while Dickens gave the poor a voice on the page, transforming their struggles into literature that would endure for generations, many of London's stories remained buried just beneath the surface. The city's layers of history ran deep, with each generation's experiences settling into the urban landscape like sediment in a riverbed. Long after the factories closed and the workhouses emptied, another layer of history remained hidden below the streets, waiting to be discovered by those who knew where to look. The same Thames that had carried away the waste of Dickens's London continued to flow, its currents now carrying different kinds of refuse, but still serving as a witness to the city's ongoing transformation. The cobblestones that had echoed with the footsteps of workhouse children and factory workers were now covered by asphalt, but the patterns of poverty and prosperity that had shaped those earlier lives persisted in new forms. Beneath the modern city, archaeological layers preserved evidence of the world that Dickens had known and described. Foundation stones from demolished workhouses, fragments of pottery from workers' cottages, coins dropped by children who had no others to lose, all waited in the dark soil, ready to tell their stories to anyone patient enough to listen. The legacy of Oliver Twist extended far beyond the pages of literature into the very fabric of how society understood itself. In drawing rooms across England, copies of Bentley's Miscellany were passed from hand to hand, each reader carrying forward not just entertainment, but a new way of seeing the world around them. Servants in grand houses recognized themselves in Dickens's descriptions of the working poor. Factory owners found themselves confronted with uncomfortable parallels between their own establishments and the institutions Dickens condemned. The novel's influence spread through unexpected channels. Clergymen quoted Oliver Twist from pulpits, using the story to illustrate Christian duty toward the less fortunate. Teachers read passages aloud in schools, helping children understand that the poor were not different species, but fellow human beings deserving of sympathy. Even in gentlemen's clubs, where political discussions typically remained abstract, members found themselves debating the specific conditions Dickens described. This cultural penetration was unprecedented for a work of fiction. Previous novels had entertained or edified their readers, but Oliver Twist actually changed how people behaved. Charitable donations increased in the months following each installment's publication. Volunteer organizations reported new members who cited the novel as their inspiration. Local governments found themselves facing increased scrutiny of their poorhouse operations. The international reach of Dickens's work amplified its impact even further. Translations appeared across Europe, carrying the story's message to societies grappling with their own industrial transformations. American readers, already engaged in debates about slavery and labor conditions, found in Oliver Twist a powerful argument for social reform that transcended national boundaries. Publishers in other countries discovered that stories combining social criticism with compelling narrative could command both popular and critical success. A new genre was emerging, one that would influence writers from Victor Hugo to Émile Zola, all of whom recognized that literature could serve as both art and activism. The novel's success also transformed Dickens's own understanding of his role as a writer. He had begun his career as a journalist and entertainer, but Oliver Twist revealed that he possessed a unique power to shape public opinion. This realization would inform every subsequent work, as he consciously crafted stories designed not just to entertain, but to educate and inspire action. His relationship with his readers became almost collaborative. He received hundreds of letters from people sharing their own experiences of poverty, their observations of workhouse conditions, their suggestions for future stories. These correspondences provided him with a steady stream of material, while also confirming that his fictional depictions matched lived reality. Some letters came from former workhouse inmates who thanked him for telling their stories. Others arrived from middle-class readers who had begun visiting poorhouses and prisons after reading his work. A few came from government officials who either praised his accuracy or disputed his conclusions. All of them demonstrated that Oliver Twist had succeeded in making abstract social problems intensely personal. The serial publication format created a unique intimacy between author and audience. Dickens could respond to reader reactions in subsequent installments, emphasizing themes that resonated most strongly or addressing criticisms that appeared in reviews and letters. This ongoing dialogue meant that the novel evolved in response to its reception, becoming not just Dickens's vision, but a collaborative exploration of social problems. Public readings of the novel became popular entertainment, with professional readers and amateur enthusiasts alike performing scenes for audiences who had already read the story but wanted to experience it communally. These performances often took place in venues that served multiple social classes, creating rare opportunities for shared emotional experiences across economic divisions. The character of Oliver himself became a cultural reference point that extended far beyond literature. Political cartoonists used his image to represent the plight of the poor. Reformers invoked his name when arguing for specific policy changes. Even children's games began incorporating elements from the story, as young people acted out scenes of workhouse life and criminal adventure. This cultural saturation meant that Oliver Twist influenced not just how people thought about poverty, but how they talked about it. The vocabulary Dickens used to describe social problems entered common speech. Terms like workhouse and poorhouse carried new emotional weight. The phrase, "Please, sir, I want some more," became shorthand for legitimate demands that were unreasonably denied. The novel's impact on other writers was immediate and lasting. Elizabeth Gaskell's industrial novels drew heavily on Dickens's model of combining social criticism with dramatic storytelling. Benjamin Disraeli's political fiction adopted similar techniques to explore class conflict. Even writers who disagreed with Dickens's politics acknowledged his innovation in using popular fiction as a vehicle for serious social commentary. Academic study of literature began to take novels more seriously as a result of works like Oliver Twist. Previously, fiction had been considered mere entertainment, unworthy of scholarly attention. But Dickens demonstrated that novels could address the most pressing issues of their time with sophistication and insight that matched any other form of intellectual discourse. The legal profession found itself grappling with questions raised by the novel's portrayal of justice and social responsibility. Lawyers debated whether existing laws adequately protected the vulnerable populations Dickens described. Judges began considering the social context of crimes committed by people driven to desperation by circumstances beyond their control. Medical professionals also responded to the novel's depictions of how poverty affected physical and mental health. Physicians began paying more attention to the social determinants of disease, recognizing that many health problems originated in living conditions rather than individual failings. This shift in medical thinking would eventually contribute to public health reforms. The business community's reaction was more complex and often defensive. Some industrialists argued that Dickens exaggerated problems or unfairly blamed employers for broader social issues. Others, however, began examining their own practices and implementing improvements in working conditions. The novel forced a conversation about corporate responsibility that had previously been avoided. Educational institutions started incorporating social awareness into their curricula, partly in response to the cultural changes Dickens had helped create. Schools began teaching about contemporary social problems alongside historical subjects. Universities introduced courses examining the relationship between literature and social reform. The women's movement found particular inspiration in Dickens's portrayal of female characters who struggled against systemic oppression. Nancy's tragic fate in Oliver Twist became a rallying point for discussions about how society failed to protect vulnerable women. Reform organizations began addressing issues specific to women in poverty, such as prostitution and domestic violence. Religious denominations split along lines partly defined by their response to social reform literature. Progressive churches embraced the social gospel movement, which emphasized addressing earthly suffering as well as spiritual salvation. Conservative congregations worried that too much focus on social problems distracted from religious duties. The novel's influence even extended to architecture and urban planning. Reformers began advocating for better housing design, public spaces that could serve poor communities, and institutional buildings that preserved human dignity rather than deliberately destroying it. The physical environment, they argued, shaped human behavior just as powerfully as laws and customs. International diplomacy felt the impact as well. Countries began comparing their social policies to those of their neighbors, with works like Oliver Twist providing a common reference point for discussions about national character and moral progress. Social reform became a measure of civilized advancement, not just economic development. The entertainment industry was transformed by the popularity of socially conscious fiction. Theaters began producing plays based on Dickens's novels. Opera companies commissioned works exploring similar themes. Even popular songs began incorporating social commentary alongside traditional romantic and patriotic themes. Publishing itself changed in response to the success of Oliver Twist and similar works. Publishers began actively seeking manuscripts that combined entertainment value with social relevance. The market for serious fiction expanded as readers demonstrated their appetite for stories that challenged them intellectually and emotionally. The concept of celebrity authorship emerged partly from Dickens's fame following Oliver Twist. Writers became public figures whose opinions on social issues carried weight beyond their literary merits. This development created new opportunities for influence, but also new pressures and responsibilities. Children's literature began incorporating more realistic portrayals of social conditions after Oliver. Twist demonstrated that young readers could handle serious subjects when presented appropriately. Educational reformers argued that sheltering children from knowledge of social problems left them unprepared for adult citizenship. The novel's psychological insights contributed to emerging understanding of human behavior and social development. Early sociologists found in Dickens's character studies examples of how environment shaped personality and life choices. This scientific interest in fiction marked a new recognition of literature's analytical value. Art and illustration flourished in response to the visual richness of Dickens's descriptions. The original illustrations for Oliver Twist by George Cruikshank became almost as famous as the text itself. Other artists began creating works inspired by the novel's scenes and characters, contributing to a broader cultural conversation about social conditions. Photography, still a new medium, began documenting the kinds of scenes Dickens described in fiction. These images provided visual confirmation of his literary portrayals, while also extending his influence to audiences who might not read novels, but could respond to photographic evidence. The temperance movement adopted Oliver Twist as supporting evidence for their campaigns against alcohol. They argued that drinking contributed to the poverty and family breakdown Dickens depicted, using his characters as cautionary examples of alcohol's destructive effects on already vulnerable populations. Labor organizations found in the novel a powerful argument for workers' rights and collective action. Although Oliver Twist focused on the plight of children and the unemployed rather than industrial workers, union leaders saw parallels between institutional oppression and workplace exploitation. Scientific societies began studying the social conditions Dickens described, conducting investigations that combined literary analysis with empirical research. This interdisciplinary approach marked a new recognition that fiction could provide valuable data about human behavior and social organization. The novel's exploration of crime and punishment influenced criminology as an emerging field of study. Scholars began examining the social causes of criminal behavior rather than simply cataloging criminal acts. This shift toward understanding crime as a social phenomenon rather than individual moral failure reflected ideas that Dickens had popularized through his fiction. So now, let's drift deeper into the underground world of industrial London, a place of lost basements, forgotten tunnels, and silent rooms where the city's working past still lingers, where the voices that Dickens amplified in his fiction continue to whisper from the shadows, and where the true cost of progress remains written in brick and stone and human memory. Beneath the busy streets of modern London, where buses rumble and pedestrians hurry from shop to shop, lies another city, a silent one, a city of brick-lined tunnels, sealed doorways, and forgotten basements that haven't felt a human presence in decades. If you could peel back the layers of pavement and soil, you would find this other London, a place where the air stays cool and damp no matter the season, where dust hangs in thick curtains and old iron beams sit rusting in the dark. The smell down here is distinctive, a mixture of old mortar, stagnant water, and something else harder to define. Something that speaks of time itself, of decades upon decades of stillness. The walls tell stories in their stains and scratches. Watermarks show where ancient floods once reached, leaving behind mineral deposits that streak the brickwork like tears. Iron fixtures, once painted bright colors, now wear coats of rust so thick they crumble at the touch. Wooden beams, seasoned by decades of moisture, have turned black as coal, their grains standing out in sharp relief against the pale brick. During the height of the Industrial Revolution, these spaces had a purpose. They were storage rooms for factories, holding everything from coal to raw textiles. They were hidden workrooms where men and women labored out of sight, sorting, stitching, or assembling goods by gaslight. The scale of these operations was staggering. Single basements might stretch the length of entire city blocks, divided into chambers by thick walls that muffled sound and contained the different trades within. In the textile districts, basement workers sorted mountains of raw cotton and wool by hand, their fingers growing nimble and quick through endless repetition. The air was thick with fibers that caught the light like snow, settling on every surface until the workers looked like ghosts moving through a white fog. Women worked in long rows, their backs bent over sorting tables, separating good thread from bad, while overhead the massive looms thundered with mechanical precision. The piecework system meant that speed was everything. A woman might earn 3 shillings for sorting 100 weight of cotton, but only if she could manage it within a single day. The pressure was relentless. Children as young as 8 worked alongside their mothers, their small fingers ideal for the delicate work of removing knots and tangles. They learned to work by feel as much as sight, since the gas flames that provided light were kept low to prevent fires in the fiber-filled air. Some basements stretched out below textile mills, where the steady rhythm of spinning machines filled the air above. The vibrations from the machinery created a constant tremor that ran through the floors and walls, a mechanical heartbeat that workers felt in their bones. The sound was so constant that many described a strange silence when the machines finally stopped at the end of each day, as if the world itself had held its breath. These mill basements served multiple purposes beyond simple storage. They housed the massive gear systems that drove the looms above, great iron wheels and leather belts that transferred power from the steam engines to the production floors. The engineering was crude but effective, and the constant motion created a dangerous environment where loose clothing or a moment's inattention could prove fatal. Workers developed their own language of survival down here. They learned to read the sounds of the machinery, to detect the subtle changes in rhythm that might signal a broken belt or failing gear. They communicated through hand signals, where the noise made speech impossible, and they developed an almost supernatural awareness of moving parts and dangerous spaces. Others sat beneath breweries, where the smell of yeast and malt drifted down through narrow stairwells. The brewing basements were worlds unto themselves, filled with massive copper vats and endless rows of barrels aging in the cool darkness. The work here was different from the textile mills, requiring knowledge of fermentation and timing that took years to master. Brewery workers lived by the rhythm of the brewing process. They rose before dawn to tend the fires that heated the brewing vessels, carefully monitoring temperatures that could make the difference between a profitable batch and a complete loss. The air was warm and humid, thick with the sweet smell of fermenting grain and the sharper scent of hops. The cellar work was particularly demanding. Workers rolled heavy barrels through narrow passages, stacking them in precise arrangements that maximized storage while allowing for proper aging. A single barrel might weigh over 200 pounds when full, and moving them required both strength and technique. The floor was always slick with spilled beer and condensation, making footing treacherous. But the brewery basements also fostered a sense of community rare in industrial workplaces. The brewing process required coordination between different teams, and workers developed strong bonds built on mutual dependence. They shared knowledge freely, teaching apprentices not just the technical aspects of brewing, but the subtle arts of reading fermentation and judging quality by smell and taste. A few were connected to old print shops, where ink-stained apprentices once hurried from one set of presses to another, their footsteps quick and light on the stone floors. The printing trade basements were perhaps the most complex of all industrial underground spaces, filled with massive wooden cases containing thousands of individual metal letters, each sorted by size and style. The work required extraordinary precision and attention to detail. A single misplaced letter could ruin an entire page, and reprinting meant not just lost time, but wasted paper and ink. Apprentices spent months learning the layout of the type cases, memorizing the position of every character until they could select letters by feel alone. The smell of these spaces was unique, a combination of metal, ink, and the peculiar odor of hot type metal. The printing presses themselves were marvels of mechanical engineering, requiring careful adjustment and constant maintenance. The pressmen who operated them were considered skilled craftsmen, their work requiring both physical strength and delicate touch. Typesetting was done entirely by hand, with compositors building lines of text letter by letter in metal frames called composing sticks. The work was painstaking and required years of training to achieve reasonable speed. A skilled compositor might set 1,000 words in a day, But the concentration required was intense, and mistakes were costly. The basement workshops also served as schools for the trade. Master printers took on apprentices who lived and worked in these underground spaces, learning not just the technical skills, but the business of printing. They learned to judge paper quality, to mix inks for different effects, and to read the subtle signs that indicated when a press was properly adjusted. And then there were the coal cellars, long, narrow vaults where workers hauled black dust by the shovelful, stacking it in neat piles for delivery to nearby homes. The air in these rooms was thick, gritty, and hard to breathe. The coal cellars represented the fuel that powered the entire industrial machine, and the work here was among the most dangerous and demanding in the underground economy. Coal heavers worked in teams, moving tons of fuel from storage areas to delivery carts. The work was backbreaking, performed in air so thick with coal dust that visibility was often reduced to just a few feet. Workers wrapped cloth around their faces, but nothing could completely filter out the fine particles that settled in their lungs and stained their skin permanently black. The cellars themselves were engineering marvels in their own right, designed to store massive quantities of coal while providing easy access for loading and unloading. They featured sloped floors that allowed coal to flow naturally toward loading areas, and ventilation systems that tried, with limited success, to clear the air of dust. The social structure of the coal cellars was strictly hierarchical. Gang leaders controlled the work crews and negotiated prices with suppliers and customers. They often took a percentage of each worker's wages in exchange for steady employment, a system that trapped many in perpetual debt. The strongest workers commanded the highest wages, but even they rarely earned enough to escape the grinding poverty that characterized life in industrial London. The physical toll was enormous. Coal heavers aged quickly, their bodies worn down by constant heavy lifting and the effects of breathing coal dust. Many developed respiratory problems that made continued work impossible, and there was no system of support for those who could no longer labor. Yet even in these harsh conditions, workers found ways to maintain dignity and community. They developed their own codes of conduct, looked after the families of injured colleagues, and created informal networks of mutual support that helped them survive in an indifferent industrial system. Many of these spaces became makeshift shelters for the city's poorest residents during harsh winters. People would slip down forgotten staircases at night, curling up between crates or sacks, anything to escape the cold wind above. The basement homeless developed their own culture and survival strategies, turning abandoned workspaces into temporary communities. These underground refuges offered protection from both weather and the authorities, who often harassed the homeless in public spaces. The basements provided a degree of privacy and security that was impossible to find on the streets, and those who knew about them guarded the knowledge carefully. The makeshift communities that formed in abandoned basements often included entire families. Children grew up in these underground spaces, learning to navigate by touch in the darkness and developing a deep knowledge of the hidden pathways that connected different areas. They became guides for newcomers, leading them to safer areas and warning them away from dangerous structures. Some left behind small traces of their stay: a burnt candle stub on a stone ledge, a discarded shoe, faint fingerprints in the soot along the walls. These remnants tell stories of lives lived in the margins, of people who found shelter in the forgotten spaces of the industrial city. The artifacts left behind speak to the ingenuity of those who lived in these spaces. Makeshift furniture carved from wooden crates, cooking fires built in metal containers, and bedding made from scraps of fabric and paper. Every item served multiple purposes, and nothing was wasted. Personal belongings found in these spaces reveal the humanity of their former occupants. A child's toy made from wire and cloth, a woman's hair ribbon, a man's pipe carved from a piece of wood. These objects remind us that even in the most desperate circumstances, people maintained their dignity and their connections to the things that made life meaningful. The seasonal rhythms of basement life followed the harsh realities of London weather. Summer brought different challenges as the enclosed spaces became stifling and airless. But winter drove people underground in waves, turning the basements into overcrowded refuges where disease spread quickly and tensions ran high. Over time, as industries changed and buildings shifted, many of these basements were sealed off. New foundations were poured. Streets were widened. Entire blocks were leveled and rebuilt. But below it all, the ruins remained. The process of urban renewal that transformed London's surface left the underground largely untouched, creating a preserved record of industrial life that archaeologists are only now beginning to understand. The sealing of these spaces was often haphazard, done with whatever materials were at hand. Builders simply bricked up stairwells and filled entrance shafts with rubble, leaving entire basement complexes intact but inaccessible. In some cases, the sealing process trapped artifacts and even structural elements that provide invaluable insights into industrial techniques and working conditions. The construction methods used to seal these spaces often tell their own stories. Hasty brickwork and irregular mortar joints suggest that the sealing was done quickly and cheaply, with little regard for preservation. In contrast, some basements were sealed with more care, suggesting that someone recognized their historical value even as they were being closed off. The geological effects of sealing these spaces have been profound. Without ventilation, many basements had developed unique microenvironments that have preserved organic materials that would normally decay. Wooden tools, leather goods, and even paper documents have survived in remarkable condition, protected by the stable temperature and humidity of the sealed chambers. Archaeologists working in London today occasionally rediscover these lost spaces. Sometimes it happens during construction projects, when crews digging for new subway lines or building renovations break through to an old chamber no one remembered was there. These discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of industrial London, providing physical evidence of working conditions and living standards that were previously known only through written records. The archaeological techniques used to study these spaces are constantly evolving. Modern methods allow researchers to map entire basement complexes without disturbing the artifacts within, using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies. This approach preserves the archaeological context while providing detailed information about the layout and contents of the spaces. Each discovery brings new insights into the daily lives of industrial workers. The distribution of artifacts reveals patterns of work and social organization that were invisible in contemporary accounts. Tool marks on wooden surfaces show how workers adapted their equipment to specific tasks. Wear patterns on floors indicate the most heavily used pathways and work areas. Collaboration between archaeologists and urban planners has become increasingly important as London continues to develop. New construction projects now routinely include archaeological surveys, and significant discoveries can alter development plans. This integration of historical preservation with modern urban planning represents a new approach to city development that acknowledges the value of the underground archaeological record. In one case, workers near Whitechapel uncovered the basement of a 19th century match factory, still filled with fragments of glass bottles and rusted machinery. The discovery provided unprecedented insight into the dangerous working conditions of match production, including evidence of the chemicals used in the manufacturing process and the crude safety measures employed to protect workers. The match factory basement contained layers of phosphorus residue that told the story of a deadly industry. Match production in the 19th century relied on white phosphorus, a chemical that caused a horrific condition known as phossy jaw among workers. The basement artifacts included special masks and protective clothing that showed how workers tried to protect themselves from the toxic fumes. The machinery found in the match factory basement was remarkable for its ingenuity and its dangers. Hand-operated cutting devices that shaped wooden matchsticks, mixing bowls where phosphorus paste was prepared, drying racks where finished matches were laid out to cure. Every piece of equipment bore the marks of heavy use and improvised repairs. The working conditions revealed by this discovery were appalling even by the standards of industrial London. The basement had no natural ventilation, and the artificial ventilation system was clearly inadequate. Workers would have spent their entire shifts breathing poisonous fumes in an environment that was essentially a giant chemical laboratory. Yet the artifacts also revealed the skill and creativity of the workers. They had developed specialized tools and techniques that maximized production while minimizing exposure to dangerous chemicals. The precision of their work, evident in the uniform size and quality of the match components found in the basement, demonstrated a level of craftsmanship that belied the brutal conditions under which they labored. In another, beneath a busy street near Southwark, a sealed brick room emerged, lined with old barrels and crates, perfectly preserved by decades of still air and darkness. This discovery revealed the complexity of the distribution networks that supplied London's growing population, showing how goods moved through the city via underground storage and transportation systems. The Southwark storage basement was a masterpiece of 19th century logistics. The barrels were arranged in a complex system that allowed for efficient loading and unloading while maximizing storage capacity. Each barrel bore markings that indicated its contents, origin, and destination, creating a detailed record of trade patterns and commercial relationships. The preservation of organic materials in this basement was extraordinary. Wooden barrel staves showed the marks of the tools used to shape them. Rope and cloth wrappings remained intact, revealing the techniques used to protect goods during transport. Even paper labels and documents survived, providing direct evidence of the commercial operations that used this space. The variety of goods stored in this basement reflected London's position as a global trading center. Spices from India, tobacco from America, wine from France, and manufactured goods from all over Britain had passed through this single underground chamber. The international scope of the trade was evident in the different barrel styles and construction techniques that reflected the manufacturing traditions of various countries. The basement also contained evidence of the human side of the storage business. Personal belongings left by workers included tools, clothing, and even food containers. These artifacts revealed the working conditions and daily routines of the men who spent their lives in these underground spaces, moving goods and maintaining the commercial infrastructure that fed the growing city. Then there are the so-called ghost stations, abandoned sections of the London Underground that once served thousands of passengers each day, but now sit empty and silent. These tunnels, with their peeling posters and silent platforms, offer another kind of industrial archaeology, where echoes linger long after the last train has passed. The ghost stations represent a different type of underground space, one designed for movement rather than storage or production. Yet they share with the industrial basements a sense of time suspended, of human activity suddenly halted and preserved in place. The advertising posters that still cling to the walls provide a snapshot of London life at the moment these stations were abandoned. Each ghost station tells its own story of urban planning and changing transportation needs. Some were closed because they were too close to other stations, victims of the underground's expansion and rationalization. Others became obsolete when new lines were built that bypassed them entirely. A few were casualties of war, damaged by bombing and never rebuilt. The architecture of these abandoned stations reflects the optimism and engineering confidence of their era. Grand entrances, ornate tilework, and spacious platforms designed to handle crowds that would never come. The contrast between the grandeur of the design and the current emptiness creates a poignant reminder of how quickly urban landscapes can change. The preservation of these spaces has been largely accidental. Unlike the industrial basements that were deliberately sealed, the ghost stations were simply abandoned, left to decay naturally. This has created unique environments where the passage of time is visible in the slow deterioration of materials and the gradual invasion of plant and animal life. Some basements tell even sadder stories. During bombings in the Second World War, many Londoners sought shelter in old factory basements. Some of these spaces became overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and dangerously unstable. Even now, traces of these wartime moments remain. Chalk markings on the walls, counting how many people could safely fit. Old benches still bolted to the floor. Empty water tins stacked neatly in corners. The wartime use of industrial basements transformed these spaces from workplaces into refuges for entire communities. Families would arrive each evening as the air raid sirens sounded, carrying blankets, food, and personal belongings for what might be a long night underground. The basements that had once echoed with the sounds of industrial production now filled with the voices of frightened civilians, seeking safety from the bombs falling above. The organization of these shelter spaces revealed both the resilience and the social divisions of wartime London. Some basements developed sophisticated systems of governance, with elected committees that assigned sleeping spaces, organized communal meals, and maintained sanitation facilities. Others remained chaotic, with conflicts over space and resources, creating tension among the sheltering families. The physical modifications made to accommodate civilian use are still visible in many of these spaces. Partition walls built from salvaged materials to create family areas. Makeshift toilet facilities constructed in corners. Ventilation systems jerry-rigged to bring fresh air into spaces that were never designed for long-term human habitation. The children who spent their nights in these basement shelters developed their own culture and games adapted to the underground environment. They created elaborate play areas in unused corners, using scraps of material and abandoned industrial equipment as toys. Their drawings, scratched into walls and preserved by the stable underground environment, provide a child's perspective on the war that is both touching and heartbreaking. The psychological impact of spending months or years in these underground shelters was profound. Many residents developed what would now be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress, struggling with claustrophobia and anxiety that persisted long after the war ended. Yet they also formed deep bonds with their fellow shelter dwellers, creating communities that continued to meet and support each other for decades after the bombing ended. The wartime use of these basements also revealed the inadequacy of official shelter provisions. The government's shelter program was overwhelmed by the scale of the bombing, and people were forced to create their own safety wherever they could find it. The industrial basements, with their thick walls and underground location, offered better protection than many official shelters. But they were also more dangerous due to their age and the modifications made to accommodate civilian use. For those who study London's industrial past, these underground rooms offer more than just history. They offer a sense of time standing still. A place where the noise of machines and the shouts of workers seem just a little too close, as if the past hasn't fully let go. The sensory experience of visiting these spaces is overwhelming, with the accumulated weight of decades of human activity still palpable in the air. The archaeological study of these spaces has revolutionized our understanding of industrial working conditions. Traditional historical sources, written by middle-class observers or factory owners, often minimize the harsh realities of industrial work. The physical evidence found in the basements tells a different story, revealing the true cost of industrial progress in human terms. The preservation of these spaces has become a priority for London's heritage organizations. Many are now protected as archaeological sites, and some have been opened to the public as museums. The challenge is balancing preservation with accessibility, allowing people to experience these spaces while protecting them from the damage that increased human activity inevitably brings. The educational value of these underground spaces cannot be overstated. They provide a tangible connection to London's industrial past that no amount of written description can match. Students who visit these spaces gain an immediate understanding of working conditions and social relationships that textbooks can only describe in abstract terms. The ongoing discovery of new basement spaces continues to surprise archaeologists and historians. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified dozens of sealed chambers beneath London's streets, each potentially containing artifacts and information that could further our understanding of the city's industrial heritage. The challenge is finding the resources to properly excavate and study these discoveries. And if you listen closely, beneath the hum of modern traffic and the distant rattle of underground trains, you might almost hear it. The soft clatter of tools, the low murmur of tired voices, the distant cough of a coal worker clearing the dust from his throat. These sounds, whether real or imagined, connect us to the countless individuals who lived and worked in these forgotten spaces. The acoustic properties of these underground spaces are remarkable. The thick walls and enclosed nature of the basements create unique sound environments where whispers can carry across large distances while loud noises are muffled and contained. Workers developed their own systems of communication adapted to these acoustic conditions, using rhythm and repetition to convey information across the noise of industrial production. The silence that now fills these spaces is itself a kind of artifact, a negative space that defines what is missing as much as what remains. The absence of human voices, of machinery, of the constant activity that once filled these chambers, creates an emptiness that is almost physical in its presence. London grew upward and outward, but it never stopped building downward, layer upon layer, century after century. And somewhere beneath the shops, the banks, and the sidewalks, the basements remain, silent, dark, and waiting. The vertical dimension of London's growth is often overlooked, but it is just as significant as the horizontal expansion that created the sprawling metropolis we know today. The geological record of London reveals this layered history in cross-section. Each era of construction added new levels to the underground landscape, creating a complex three-dimensional archive of urban development. The Roman foundations, the medieval cellars, the industrial basements, and the modern infrastructure all exist in a vertical stack that tells the story of 2,000 years of continuous habitation. The engineering challenges of building downward were immense. Each new layer of construction had to account for the structures already below, creating complex problems of load distribution and structural support. The solutions developed by generations of builders represent a tradition of underground construction that rivals any in the world. The economic value of underground space in London has always been significant. From the medieval period onward, the ability to expand downward allowed property owners to maximize the use of expensive urban land. The industrial basements represented a massive investment in underground infrastructure that supported the city's economic growth. The environmental impact of this underground development is only now being understood. The sealed basements create unique ecosystems where specialized bacteria and fungi thrive in the absence of light and oxygen. These microenvironments may hold keys to understanding how life adapts to extreme conditions, with implications for fields ranging from medicine to space exploration. And while the poor worked and slept in cold basements or crowded dormitories, another world existed just a few streets away. A world of warm dining rooms, soft carpets, and glittering chandeliers. The contrast between these two Londons, one above ground and one below, one wealthy and one poor, one visible and one hidden, defined the character of the industrial city. The physical proximity of these contrasting worlds was one of the most striking features of industrial London. A wealthy merchant's mansion might sit directly above a basement workshop, where dozens of people labored in conditions of extreme hardship. The sound of elegant dinner parties might filter down through the floors, to workers toiling by gaslight in the chambers below. This vertical segregation of social classes was both more intimate and more complete than the horizontal segregation that characterized later urban development. The wealthy could not entirely escape the reality of industrial production because it literally supported their comfortable lives. The smoke from basement workshops rose through their floorboards, and the vibrations from underground machinery shook their elegant furniture. Yet this proximity also enabled a willful blindness to the conditions that supported upper-class comfort. The basement workers were literally invisible, their labor hidden beneath the floors of polite society. This physical separation allowed the wealthy to enjoy the products of industrial labor while remaining ignorant of the human cost of their comfort. So now, let's leave the cold stone walls behind for a while and step into the polished halls of the Victorian elite. A place where the tables were heavy with silver, the conversation light with gossip, and the biggest worry was often what to wear to dinner. But as we ascend from these forgotten depths, we carry with us the knowledge of what lay beneath, the understanding that every gleaming surface above was supported by the sweat and struggle of those who worked in the darkness below. For in the grand houses of London's elite, where crystal glasses caught the light of gas chandeliers and silk gowns rustled across polished floors, the wealth that funded such luxury was built quite literally on the backs of those who labored in the forgotten basements we have just explored. While the poor in Victorian London scraped together enough to survive each day, another world existed behind tall gates and thick velvet curtains. The world of the aristocracy. A life defined not by hunger or labor, but by ceremony, indulgence, and endless social ritual. The divide between these two worlds was not merely economic, but architectural. Where the slums pressed together in narrow, lightless streets, the wealthy neighborhoods spread themselves with deliberate spaciousness. Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington boasted wide boulevards lined with plane trees, their branches forming natural canopies over polished cobblestones. The houses themselves stood like monuments to prosperity, their Georgian and early Victorian facades adorned with wrought iron balconies, marble steps, and gleaming brass door knockers that caught the afternoon sun. Behind these imposing exteriors lay worlds of calculated luxury. Each townhouse was a carefully orchestrated machine of comfort and display, staffed by armies of servants whose lives revolved entirely around maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance. The basement kitchens buzzed with activity from dawn until well past midnight, while the upper floors maintained an atmosphere of serene refinement that suggested leisure was the natural state of their inhabitants. Imagine entering the grand dining room of such a London townhouse in 1870. The ceilings stretch high overhead, trimmed with elaborate plasterwork that speaks of craftsmen who spent months perfecting each rosette and cornice. Italian plasterers, many of them, brought in specifically for their skill with ornamental work that transformed functional spaces into galleries of artistic achievement. Chandeliers hang heavy with crystal, their candlelight flickering softly against polished silver and cut glass, each piece positioned with mathematical precision to catch and multiply the light into dancing rainbows across the walls. The wallpaper itself tells a story of wealth and taste. Hand-painted silk from lion, perhaps, or velvet flock in deep burgundies and forest greens that required special brushes to maintain their texture. The patterns were often inspired by medieval tapestries or exotic motifs from the expanding British Empire, bringing echoes of distant lands into these carefully controlled environments. Gilt-framed portraits of ancestors gazed down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to monitor the proceedings below with the authority of generations past. The scent in the air is a complex layering of luxury. Beeswax from freshly polished furniture mingles with the more subtle aromas of aged wood and fine leather from the bindings of books that line built-in shelves. The subtle tang of wine drifts from the crystal decanters on the sideboard, where port and sherry wait patiently for the appropriate moment in the evening's progression. The faint perfume worn by the women seated along the table adds floral notes to this olfactory symphony, but it is perfume applied with restraint, for vulgarity was the greatest sign in such circles. The fire crackles in the marble hearth, its warmth radiating across Persian rugs whose intricate patterns had been woven by hands thousands of miles away. Heavy curtains of damask or velvet, blocked the chill from the tall windows, their rich fabrics falling in careful folds that had been arranged that vary, afternoon by housemaids trained in the precise art of drapery. The room is warm and still, a pocket of comfort carved out against the November fog that clung to London streets. Dinner begins late, often around 8 in the evening, but the evening's social choreography had commenced hours earlier. At 6, guests began arriving for what was delicately termed the cocktail hour, though the drinks served were more likely to be sherry or champagne than the mixed spirits that would later become fashionable. The drawing room filled gradually with the rustle of silk and the soft murmur of carefully modulated conversation. Men arrived in their evening dress, the severity of black and white relieved only by the gleam of gold watch chains and the occasional flash of a jeweled stud. Women appeared in gowns that represented months of planning and considerable expense, each dress a statement of both fashion and status that would be noted and discussed long after the evening ended. The seating arrangement represented one of the most complex social calculations of the Victorian era. The hostess had likely spent days consulting her husband and perhaps even her closest female friends about the placement of each guest. Rank demanded certain positions, with the highest-ranking gentleman escorting the hostess to the table, while the highest-ranking lady received the honor of the host's arm. But beyond the basic requirements of precedence lay the more subtle art of creating compatible conversational pairings. A bore could ruin an entire section of a table, while placing two people with conflicting political views too close together might result in the kind of heated discussion that could end friendships. The goal was to create an atmosphere where wit could flourish without controversy, where stories could be shared without scandal, and where each guest felt themselves to be in exactly the right place among exactly the right people. Everything, from the placement of each fork to the order of the courses, follows an unspoken code that had been refined over generations of social dining. The table setting itself was a work of art, with multiple courses requiring multiple sets of cutlery arranged in precise order of use. Crystal glasses stood ready for different wines, their positions as fixed as the stars in the constellation of fine dining. Salt cellars were placed at regular intervals, for salt was still precious enough to be presented in small silver vessels rather than casually scattered. The napkins, heavy linen damask, were folded into architectural shapes that had been practiced by servants until they could execute them blindfolded. Servants moved quietly behind the guests, dressed in crisp uniforms that spoke of their place in the household hierarchy. A butler, distinguished by his black tailcoat and white gloves, supervised the service with the authority of a general commanding troops. Footmen carry silver trays with practiced ease, their movements so smooth they seemed to float rather than walk. Their training had begun years earlier, often as hall boys or page boys, and they had worked their way up through a system as rigid as any military organization. Each course is brought out and cleared away with barely a sound, the servants having learned to move with a ghostly efficiency that kept them present but invisible, essential but unnoticed. The kitchen from which these courses emerged was a marvel of Victorian engineering and organization. Located in the basement to keep cooking smells and heat away from the main floors, it centered around a massive cast-iron range that burned coal around the clock. Copper pots hung from hooks along the walls, their surfaces burnished to mirror brightness by scullery maids who rose before dawn to begin their polishing. The kitchen staff worked under the stern eye of the cook, usually a woman whose authority in her domain rivaled that of the master of the house upstairs. She commanded kitchen maids, scullery maids, and often a kitchen boy whose job it was to keep the fires burning and haul water from the pumps in the basement courtyard. The meal itself is a slow procession of flavors and textures that could last 3 hours or more. A typical dinner might begin with clear soups, but these were not simple broths. They were carefully crafted consommes that required days of preparation, with bones roasted and simmered until they released every trace of flavor, then clarified with egg whites until they achieved the crystal transparency that marked the cook's skill. Mock turtle soup, made from calf's head and sherry, was considered the height of elegance. Its complex preparation a demonstration of the kitchen's sophistication. Following the soups came fish dishes like sole or salmon, served with delicate sauces that represented the pinnacle of French culinary influence on English dining. The fish had been selected that morning at Billingsgate Market by the cook herself or her most trusted deputy, chosen not just for freshness, but for the precise size needed to serve the expected number of guests. Dover sole might be served with a sauce of lobster butter and champagne, while salmon could be presented with hollandaise that required the cook to stand stirring at the stove until her arm ached, adding butter drop by drop until the emulsion achieved perfect smoothness. Then come the meat courses, the heart of the Victorian dinner and the point at which the kitchen's resources are most severely tested. Roasted beef, the pride of English cooking, arrived at the table brown and glistening, having been turned on spits by kitchen boys whose faces bore the permanent flush of their proximity to the fires. The beef itself came from cattle raised on the estates of the wealthy, animals that had grazed on carefully tended pastures and been fattened on grain selected for its quality. Lamb with mint sauce represented a more delicate option, the meat so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork, accompanied by new potatoes that had been scraped by hand until their skins came off in silk-thin sheets. Game birds, like pheasant or quail, brought the romance of the hunt to the urban dining room. These had been shot on country estates and hung in cool larders until they achieved the proper degree of tenderness, their preparation requiring skills that separated accomplished cooks from mere kitchen help. The birds were stuffed with chestnuts or truffles, their skin basted until it crackled, and they were served with rich gravies made from their own drippings and enhanced with port wine or cognac. Vegetables were offered, though in smaller portions that reflected their status as accompaniments rather than central elements of the meal. They were often served dripping in butter or cream, transformed from simple garden produce into rich indulgences. Brussels sprouts might be tossed with bacon and chestnuts, while carrots were glazed with honey and herbs until they shone like jewels on the serving plates. Even potatoes, the humble staple of the poor, were elevated through careful preparation into dishes that bore little resemblance to their origins. The preparation of each vegetable dish required its own specialized knowledge. Asparagus had to be selected for uniform thickness and cooked until it was tender, but still maintained its shape. Green beans were topped and tailed by hand, a job often given to the newest kitchen maid as a test of her patience and attention to detail. Root vegetables were turned into perfect barrel shapes by cooks wielding sharp knives with the precision of sculptors, each piece identical in size to ensure even cooking. Afterward, the progression moved to what the Victorians called the sweet course, though these desserts bore little resemblance to the simple puddings enjoyed by ordinary families. Elaborate jellies and pastries were arranged like edible sculptures on silver stands, their creation requiring skills that bordered on artistry. Charlotte Russe, trifles layered with sponge cakes soaked in wine and topped with syllabub, and intricate pastries filled with cream and decorated with spun sugar transformed the table into a gallery of culinary art. The pastry cook, often a specialist brought in just for grand dinners, might spend days creating sugar sculptures that served as centerpieces. These ephemeral artworks, depicting everything from classical temples to elaborate bouquets of flowers, were created solely for display and admiration, their beauty lying in their temporary nature. Ice cream, still a relative novelty, requiring ice harvested from frozen ponds and stored in underground ice houses, was presented in molded shapes that reflected the evening's theme or the season. At the very end of this culinary journey, a selection of cheeses and fruits arrived, the cheeses aged in the cellars of country houses or imported from France at considerable expense. Stilton, considered the king of English cheeses, was served with port and walnuts, while softer French varieties required special knives and individual plates. The fruits were often out of season, maintained in hothouses or imported from warmer climates, making their presence on the table another subtle demonstration of wealth and privilege. Coffee followed, served in porcelain cups so delicate they seemed to barely contain the dark liquid within. The coffee itself was a blend created specifically for the household, roasted and ground fresh that day by servants who had learned to judge the perfect degree of preparation by sound and smell. For the ladies, tea might be offered as an alternative, served from silver services that had been polished that afternoon until they reflected the candlelight like mirrors. But the food, elaborate as it was, served as only the foundation for the evening's true purpose. The meal created a framework within which social relationships could be maintained, business could be conducted without the vulgarity of obvious commercial discussion, and the complex web of Victorian society could be rewoven night after night. Conversation floats along the table like a soft undercurrent, carefully modulated to avoid the rocks of controversy or the shallows of trivial gossip. Topics ranged from politics to theater, but political discussion was limited to general observations rather than partisan advocacy. The theater provided safer ground, with guests sharing opinions about the latest productions at Covent Garden or the Haymarket. Family news was exchanged, but only the sort that enhanced rather than diminished reputation. The latest fashions from Paris offered opportunities for the women to display their knowledge of style and taste, while the men might discuss their clubs, their horses, or their shooting. The tone remains light and controlled, a skill that required years of practice to master. Outbursts or strong opinions were not merely frowned upon, but could result in social exile. The ultimate punishment in a world where inclusion meant everything. Wit was welcome, but only if delivered with the kind of elegance that left no victim bleeding, no feelings genuinely hurt. The art lay in creating conversation that sparkled without burning, that entertained without offending, that allowed each participant to display their intelligence and breeding without overshadowing their companions. The women wear gowns of silk or satin that represented months of planning and considerable financial investment. Each dress was custom-made by skilled seamstresses who had served apprenticeships as rigorous as any craftsman's. The fabrics came from the finest mills in England and France, their colors achieved through expensive dyes that could fade if exposed to too much light. The bodices were tightly fitted through the use of whalebone corsets that compressed the torso into the fashionable hourglass shape, while the skirts spread wide over frames of steel hoops that required special skills to manage gracefully. Jewelry glitters at their throats and wrists, but it was jewelry selected according to strict rules of appropriateness. Diamonds were for evening wear, while pearls could be worn at any time. The settings were often family heirloom pieces, reset to accommodate contemporary fashion, creating connections between past and present that reinforced the stability of established families. Even the way jewelry was worn conveyed messages about the wearer's status and understanding of social conventions. The men were dressed in evening coats that achieved elegance through their very restraint. Black wool tailcoats with silk facings, white waistcoats, and starched white shirts created a uniform that eliminated competition through clothing and focused attention on more subtle indicators of rank and breeding. Their collars were stiff with starch, requiring careful attention to achieve the proper height and angle, while their cravats were tied in knots that had been practiced until they became second nature. Even their shoes were part of the costume, patent leather pumps that required daily attention from valets trained in the art of achieving a perfect shine. The evening's progression followed a pattern as established as liturgy. As the last course was cleared away, the hostess would catch the eye of the senior lady guest and rise, signaling that it was time for the women to withdraw. This moment required careful timing and absolute grace, for any awkwardness could disrupt the evening's flow. The ladies would retire to the drawing room, leaving the men to their cigars and port in the dining room, or perhaps a separate smoking room designed specifically for masculine retreat. If music was arranged, it began after the ladies had settled themselves in the drawing room. A hired pianist or string quartet might play softly in the background, providing an elegant soundtrack for continued conversation. The music was selected for its ability to enhance rather than dominate, creating an atmosphere of refined culture without demanding attention that might interrupt the social interaction that was the evening's true purpose. Professional musicians appreciated these engagements not only for the payment, but for the opportunity to perform in houses where their art was valued and understood. The instruments they played were often of exceptional quality, pianos by Broadwood or Urd that had been tuned that very day, strings by the finest makers whose reputation depended on the purity of their sound. The acoustics of these grand rooms, with their high ceilings and careful proportions, had often been designed with musical performance in mind. The men might gather in the smoking room for brandy and cigars, engaging in conversations that could be more direct than those permitted in mixed company. Business might be discussed, though never with the crudeness of obvious negotiation. Political opinions could be expressed more freely, though still within the bounds of gentlemanly discourse. The smoking room itself was designed as a masculine refuge, with leather chairs, dark wood paneling, and heavy curtains that contained both smoke and conversation within its walls. Cigars were selected with the same care that had gone into choosing the evening's wines. Cuban tobacco, rolled by hands trained from childhood in the art, was aged in humidors, maintained at precise temperatures and humidity levels. The ritual of cutting and lighting the cigars was as formalized as any other aspect of the evening, with specialized tools and techniques that marked the difference between gentlemen and mere pretenders to that status. Meanwhile, the women remained together in the drawing room, their conversations following different patterns but equally bound by convention. They might discuss literature, though only books that had received proper social approval. Charitable work provided acceptable topics, as did music and art. Personal matters could be shared, but only within carefully defined limits that preserved privacy while allowing for the kind of intimate exchange that bound social groups together. For many in this world, the rhythm of life moves from one such gathering to the next. The social calendar was planned months in advance, with hostesses coordinating to avoid conflicts and ensure that the same group did not meet too frequently in the same configuration. Hosting and attending social gatherings was not just entertainment, but a duty as sacred as any religious obligation. It was through these gatherings that influence was maintained, business relationships were nurtured, political alliances were formed, and marriages were arranged for the next generation. The preparation for each dinner party began days in advance. Menus had to be planned with attention, not only to the season and availability of ingredients, but to the dietary preferences and restrictions of expected guests. Invitations were written by hand on heavy paper and delivered by servants, with responses tracked as carefully as a military campaign. The guest list itself required diplomatic skills, balancing obligation with pleasure, ensuring that the mix of personalities would create the desired atmosphere of elegant conviviality. Market trips were planned with the precision of military operations. The cook, accompanied by trusted servants, would visit Leadenhall Market for poultry, Smithfield for meat, and Covent Garden for vegetables and flowers. Relationships with particular vendors were cultivated over years, ensuring access to the finest available ingredients and advance notice of special items that might enhance a particular menu. The selection process required expert knowledge, how to judge the freshness of fish by the clarity of their eyes, how to determine the proper aging of beef by its color and marbling, how to choose vegetables at their peak of ripeness and flavor. Wine selection required its own expertise. The cellar master, sometimes the butler himself, would consult with the host to choose wines that complemented each course while demonstrating the household's taste and knowledge. Vintage charts were studied, bottles were examined for proper storage conditions, and decanters were selected for their ability to enhance each wine's particular characteristics. The timing of opening bottles, allowing them to breathe, and achieving proper serving temperatures required the precision of a chemist combined with the intuition of an artist. But underneath the glittering surfaces, The concerns of the upper class were often surprisingly petty when viewed from the perspective of those struggling for basic survival. An ill-fitting dress could indeed be considered a disaster, representing not just personal embarrassment, but a failure to maintain the standards expected of one's position. The dress itself represented a substantial investment of time and money, with fittings scheduled weeks in advance and adjustments made up to the last moment to ensure perfection. A poorly cooked dish might be discussed in hushed tones for weeks, not because the food itself mattered so much, as because it reflected on the hostess's ability to manage her household and maintain proper standards. In a world where reputation was everything, such failures could have consequences that extended far beyond the dining room. Invitations might become less frequent, social standing might suffer, and the careful network of relationships that sustained upper-class life might begin to fray. A guest seated next to the wrong person could be seen as a social misstep with ramifications that extended beyond the immediate evening. Such placement errors suggested that the hostess had failed to understand subtle rankings and rivalries that governed her social world, or worse, that she had deliberately chosen to ignore them. In extreme cases, such mistakes could end friendships, create lasting resentments, and upset the delicate balance of power that made civilized social interaction possible. The rules governing these interactions were never written down, but were transmitted through generations of careful observation and instruction. Young women learned them from their mothers and aunts, practicing the art of conversation and deportment until proper behavior became instinctive. Young men absorbed the codes of masculine conduct through their fathers and their experiences at school and university, where the social hierarchies of adult life were rehearsed and refined. Servants, too, learned their roles through years of apprenticeship and observation. New staff were trained by experienced servants who understood that their own reputations depended on maintaining the standards expected by their employers. The butler might spend years teaching footmen the proper way to serve at table, while the housekeeper instructed housemaids in the art of cleaning and maintaining the delicate furnishings that surrounded them. Even the simplest tasks were performed according to established procedures that ensured consistency and prevented the kind of mistakes that could disrupt the household's smooth operation. And while servants carried trays and refilled glasses, their own lives remained almost invisible to the people they served. Behind every plate of roast lamb, every slice of elaborate pudding, there were hours of unseen labor that began before dawn and continued long after the guests had departed. Hands spent the day chopping, stirring, cleaning, and preparing, often in hot basement kitchens, far below the dining room floor where the temperature could reach unbearable levels during the preparation of elaborate meals. The physical demands of service were enormous. Kitchen maids might stand for 16 hours at a stretch, their feet swelling in boots that had to last for years, because replacement was a luxury they could not afford. Scullery maids scrubbed pots with hands that became permanently stained and roughened by the harsh soaps and constant immersion in water. Footmen carried heavy trays up flights of stairs, dozens of times each evening, their backs aching from the constant bending and lifting required by their duties. The emotional demands were equally challenging. Servants were expected to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to remain calm under pressure, and to maintain perfect composure, even when facing unreasonable demands or harsh criticism. They lived their entire working lives under scrutiny, knowing that a single mistake could result in dismissal without references, making future employment nearly impossible. Their living quarters reflected their status in the household hierarchy. The butler and cook, as senior servants, might have private rooms, while lower-ranking staff shared cramped quarters in the attics or basements. Privacy was almost non-existent. Personal belongings were minimal, and time off was limited to a few hours on Sundays and perhaps one afternoon per month. Yet these positions were coveted because they offered security and the possibility of advancement that was unavailable to workers in factories or on the streets. The contrast between the servants' world and that of their employers was most stark during evening entertainments. While guests enjoyed leisurely conversation in heated rooms, kitchen staff worked in sweltering conditions to produce the endless succession of courses. While ladies and gentlemen sipped wine and shared witticisms, chambermaids prepared bedrooms and warmed beds with copper pans filled with hot coals. The two worlds existed in the same physical space, but were separated by barriers as impermeable as prison walls. As the evening progressed and courses were cleared away, the tempo of work in the kitchen actually increased. Each dirty plate required washing in water heated over coal fires. Each glass needed careful cleaning to prevent spots. Each piece of silver demanded polishing to maintain its shine. The washing up alone could take hours, performed by scullery maids whose hands were red and raw from the constant exposure to hot water and harsh soaps. Upstairs, as the candles burned low and the last guests reached for their gloves and hats, the evening's social transactions were being completed. Business cards were exchanged, future invitations were extended, and the complex web of obligation and reciprocity that held society together was strengthened by another successful evening. Guests departed with the satisfaction of having been properly entertained and the anticipation of similar pleasures to come. But their departure was not the end of the evening for the household staff. The house settled into its nightly routine only after hours of additional work. Chambermaids lit warming pans for the beds upstairs, a process that required carrying hot coals from the kitchen fires to bedroom after bedroom, ensuring that sheets were warm and dry for the night ahead. Footmen locked the doors and secured the windows, checking each room to ensure that candles were properly extinguished and fires safely banked for the night. In the kitchen, cooks and scullery maids finally rested their tired feet only after every pot had been scrubbed, every surface cleaned, and preparations for the next day's meals begun. Bread dough was set to rise overnight, stocks were put on to simmer, and the complex schedule of the following day's work was planned and organized. Even in sleep, these servants remained on call, ready to respond to any emergency or unexpected demand from their employers. The contrast between the two worlds was most evident in their relationship to time itself. For the wealthy, time was a luxury to be savored and enjoyed, each moment of the evening carefully orchestrated for maximum pleasure and social benefit. For their servants, time was a relentless taskmaster, each minute accounted for and filled with labor that made the leisurely enjoyment of their employers possible. And so the cycle would begin again the next day, the wheels of this elaborate social machine turning with the precision of clockwork. The servants would rise before dawn to begin the endless round of tasks that maintained the illusion of effortless elegance, while their employers would wake to a world made perfect by invisible hands and devoted service. The contrast between these glittering halls and the cold workhouse, yards just a few streets away, was stark beyond imagination. Two sides of the same city, two lives lived in parallel, rarely crossing paths, except in the relationships of service and labor that bound them together in mutual dependence. The wealthy needed the labor of the poor to maintain their world of luxury, while the poor depended on the wealth of their employers for survival itself. Yet even as these parallel worlds seemed permanent and unchanging, forces were stirring that would eventually transform both. The very prosperity that allowed for such elaborate social rituals was creating new forms of wealth based on industry and commerce rather than land and inheritance. New voices were beginning to question the assumptions that justified such extreme inequality, and new ideas about social justice and human dignity were finding audiences among both the educated classes and the working poor. The gas lights that illuminated the drawing rooms of Mayfair were the same technology that lit the factories where a new working class was learning to organize and demand better conditions. The railways that brought exotic foods to upper-class tables also carried ideas and information that would eventually challenge the very foundations of the system that made such luxury possible. But for now, in the flickering candlelight of crystal chandeliers and the soft murmur of polite conversation, that world seemed as permanent as the marble facades of the houses that contained it. The rituals of dinner and society would continue, night after night, season after season, maintaining the illusion that some people were born to serve while others were destined to be served. And now, as we leave behind the echoes of laughter in chandelier-lit rooms and the quiet steps of servants retreating down stone staircases, we find ourselves back in the present, sitting comfortably in a warmer and softer world, where hunger and cold are far less likely companions. Yet the shadows cast by those gaslit evenings stretch forward through time, touching our own era in ways both subtle and profound, reminding us that the distance between comfort and desperation, between service and servitude, between dignity and degradation, may be smaller than we dare to imagine. The seasonal rhythm of these grand households followed patterns as predictable as the tides. Winter brought the height of the social season, when Parliament was in session and the wealthy flocked to their London residences from country estates. The pace of entertaining reached fever pitch, with dinner parties scheduled almost nightly, each hostess competing to outdo her rivals in elegance and sophistication. The cold months demanded heartier fare, and kitchen ranges worked overtime to produce the roasts and puddings that could warm bodies chilled by drafty carriages and unheated hallways. Spring offered different pleasures and challenges. The first asparagus of the season commanded premium prices and marked the beginning of a lighter style of cooking that would carry through to summer. Windows could be opened again, allowing fresh air to circulate through rooms that had been sealed against winter's chill. The social calendar began to shift toward country house visits, elaborate picnics, and outdoor entertainments that required different skills from both hosts and servants. Summer brought its own unique demands. While many wealthy families retreated to their country estates, those who remained in London adapted their entertaining to the season's heat. Ices became more prominent in dessert courses, cold soups appeared on menus, and dinner hours shifted later to avoid the day's most oppressive temperatures. Kitchen staff suffered particularly during these months, working in basement rooms that became furnaces as coal ranges burned continuously to meet the demands of elaborate meal preparation. The logistics of moving entire households between city and country residences twice yearly represented undertakings of military complexity. Wagons loaded with furniture, china, silver, and personal belongings wound their way along country roads, while advanced teams of servants prepared country houses that had been shuttered for months. The coordination required to ensure that every piece of equipment needed for proper entertaining was available in the right place at the right time tested the organizational skills of housekeepers and butlers who had spent years perfecting their systems. The entertainment of foreign visitors added another layer of complexity to these social calculations. Diplomats, titled Europeans, making grand tours, and wealthy Americans seeking to establish their credentials in British society all required special consideration. Their presence at dinner parties served multiple purposes. They brought news from distant places. They offered opportunities for hosts to display their cosmopolitan connections. And they provided fresh conversational material for gatherings that might otherwise become stale through repetition. Yet accommodating foreign guests required careful navigation of cultural differences and diplomatic sensitivities. French visitors expected certain standards of cuisine that challenged even accomplished cooks, while German guests might prefer different styles of service than those customary in English households. American visitors, particularly those from newly wealthy families, needed to be gently guided through the intricacies of British social protocol without being made to feel ignorant or unwelcome. The children of these households lived in a parallel universe, seeing glimpses of adult splendor, but remaining largely excluded from its full reality. Nurseries occupied the upper floors of townhouses, staffed by nannies and governesses who maintained their own hierarchies and protocols. Children took their meals separately, learning proper table manners through endless repetition and correction, preparing for the day when they would take their places at the adult table. Their education in social graces began almost from birth. Little girls learned to sit properly, speak softly, and never draw undue attention to themselves, while boys were taught the fundamentals of gentlemanly behavior that would serve them throughout their lives. Dancing masters visited regularly, teaching the steps that would be essential for future social success. Music lessons were mandatory, not because musical ability was particularly valued for its own sake, but because the ability to perform competently was expected of well-bred young people. The transition from childhood to adult participation in society was marked by elaborate coming-out rituals that represented both celebration and initiation. Presentation at court, the first formal dinner party, the first season of balls and entertainments, all served to integrate young people into the social machinery that would govern their adult lives. These rites of passage were as carefully orchestrated as the dinner parties themselves, with every detail planned to ensure that the young person made the best possible impression on society. The marriage market that operated within these social circles added another dimension to every gathering. Mothers scrutinized potential matches for their daughters, while fathers evaluated the financial and social prospects of young men who showed interest in their female offspring. Dinner parties provided opportunities for young people to meet under carefully supervised circumstances, where conversation could be monitored and compatibility assessed within the safety of established social forms. The dowry system that accompanied these arrangements required careful financial planning that often began years before a daughter reached marriageable age. Families invested in government bonds, purchased property, and accumulated the portable wealth that would accompany a bride to her new home. The negotiations surrounding marriage settlements were conducted with the same attention to detail that characterized business transactions. For in many ways, they were business transactions involving the transfer of substantial assets along with the bride herself. Medical knowledge of the era added its own constraints to social dining. The understanding of nutrition was primitive by modern standards, leading to dietary practices that emphasized quantity over balance. The wealthy suffered from their own forms of malnutrition, consuming excessive amounts of rich foods while lacking the vitamins and minerals that simpler diets might have provided. Gout was endemic among men of the upper classes, caused largely by their consumption of port wine and red meat, while women suffered from anemia due to the restrictive corsets that limited their breathing and the fashionable pallor that kept them indoors and away from sunlight. Physicians of the period prescribed elaborate dietary regimens for various ailments, often based more on classical theory than empirical observation. The wealthy could afford to follow these prescriptions, importing exotic foods believed to have medicinal properties or following complex eating schedules designed to balance the body's supposed humors. The irony was that their servants, eating simpler fare from the same kitchens, often enjoyed better health than their employers, despite their harder lives and more stressful working conditions. The religious dimensions of Victorian society cast their own shadows over these glittering gatherings. Sunday dinners followed different patterns than weekday entertainments, with menus designed to respect the Sabbath while still maintaining proper standards of hospitality. Family prayers were conducted in many households, bringing together masters and servants in moments of formal equality. That stood in stark contrast to the hierarchies that governed every other aspect of their relationships. The charitable obligations that accompanied wealth created another layer of social activity that paralleled the purely social entertaining. Ladies organized fundraising dinners for various causes, from orphanages to missionary societies, events that combined social pleasure with moral duty. These occasions required their own forms of protocol, as the presence of clergy or social reformers might influence both conversation and menu planning. The influence of empire permeated these domestic scenes in countless subtle ways. Spices from India transformed English cooking, while tea from Ceylon became an essential element of daily ritual. Servants might include former colonial subjects, bringing their own cultural perspectives to households that remained largely oblivious to the complexities of the global system that sustained their comfort. The wealth that paid for crystal chandeliers and silk gowns flowed from investments in railways, shipping, and manufacturing that connected London drawing rooms to cotton plantations, sugar estates, and trading posts scattered across the globe. The technological innovations of the age gradually infiltrated even these bastions of tradition. Gas lighting replaced candles in many rooms, though candles remained preferred for dining because their softer light was considered more flattering. The first primitive forms of central heating began to appear in the most progressive households, though most still depended on coal fires that required constant attention from servants. Improved cooking ranges made more elaborate food preparation possible, while better transportation brought exotic ingredients within reach of ambitious cooks. Communication technologies began to change the pace of social interaction as well. The penny post allowed for more frequent correspondence between friends and relatives, while early telegraph services brought news from distant places with unprecedented speed. These innovations gradually accelerated the rhythm of social life, making it possible to organize entertainments more spontaneously and to maintain relationships across greater distances than ever before. The photographic portrait studios that began appearing in fashionable districts created new opportunities for social documentation and display. Family portraits could be exchanged between friends, and the most successful party photographs might be displayed in drawing rooms alongside painted portraits of ancestors. These early photographs captured the elaborate dress and formal poses that characterized upper-class society, creating visual records that preserve the era's aesthetic ideals for future generations. The literature that emerged from this world both reflected and shaped its values. Novels by authors who moved within these social circles provided both entertainment and instruction, teaching readers the proper forms of behavior while celebrating the virtues of refinement and cultivation. Poetry and essays appeared in periodicals that circulated among the educated classes, creating shared cultural references that enhanced dinner party conversation and strengthened the bonds of social identity. The music that accompanied these gatherings reflected similar cultural currents. Piano music by popular composers was performed in drawing rooms across fashionable London, while more ambitious households might sponsor chamber music performances by professional musicians. The ability to appreciate and discuss music became another marker of cultural sophistication, and hostesses competed to present the most interesting musical programs to their guests. Art collecting provided another avenue for social competition and cultural display. Wealthy families commissioned portraits by fashionable artists, purchased landscapes and genre scenes for their walls, and competed to acquire works by recognized masters. Private galleries in the largest houses became destinations for artistic pilgrimage, and the ability to discuss painting and sculpture knowledgeably became essential equipment for social success. The gardens surrounding London townhouses, though necessarily small, were designed with the same attention to detail that characterized interior decoration. Even tiny urban plots were landscaped to provide pleasant views from dining and drawing room windows, while larger properties might include conservatories where exotic plants could be cultivated year-round. The presence of fresh flowers on dining tables required careful coordination with gardeners, who specialized in forcing blooms to appear out of season. But what happens when those carefully maintained boundaries begin to crack? When the servants who have remained invisible for so long begin to find their voices, and when the very foundations of this glittering world start to shift beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The drawing rooms may be warm and secure, but beyond their heavy curtains, change is stirring in the London fog, carrying whispers of revolution that will soon become impossible to ignore. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the cold stone floors of the workhouse to the worn ink-stained pages of Dickens' study, from the dust-filled basements beneath London streets to the candlelit dining rooms of Victorian mansions, a long, slow walk through the layered shadows of 19th century life. If you're still awake, thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the echo of workhouse bells and the quiet footsteps of servants on polished floors, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole point. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly dive into history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. It's always nice seeing where in the world these late-night history journeys are reaching. For now, I'll let the clatter of workhouse kitchens fade, the whispers from Dickens' pages grow still, and the last of the gas lamps flicker out one by one. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.